both Kevin and I are honored to be members of her community. Just a quick high-level summary: inclusive stakeholding. How many people here, raise your hand if you've heard of ESGs? Raise your hand or signal. There you go. There you go. So ESG is one of the instantiations of really identifying the stakeholders that are affected by all of our good work.
People may not know what ESG means. Maybe just explain that.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just jump right to inclusive stakeholding. Inclusive stakeholding is the idea of identifying stakeholders, but moreover, giving them a stake. So this is what we've tried to do as a global community for a long time. Just trying to take more and more responsibility for people that are maybe not in our direct experience, and even not just people, but the environment, talking about permaculture and sustainability. And when we talk about sustainability, we're also identifying future humans and animals and the future climate as a stakeholder. Stakeholding here, though, the thing that we're very interested in is how do we give them a stake in a way that they can actually benefit. So not only identifying them, but can we actually give them stock options? One of the great inventions of Silicon Valley, and we tend to think about technologies, hardware and software, and all the innovations they've brought to the world. But when you think about the fact that they actually gave labor a stake at a time when that was rarely done. At the time, capital, which is something that Jane was talking about earlier, I was trained as a capitalist too. I run a hedge fund. I'm also a medical doctor. When I think about health, it really is about sustainability of the body. And one of the ways to think about aging and decay and illness is the fact that our cells start acting more independent of each other instead of interdependent. And what Silicon Valley did was they started to restore the interdependence between humans at a time when we were really focused on independence and capitalism and competition. They actually included labor into the same side of the table as capital. Think about what Silicon Valley did in terms of giving stock options, but doing it for all the other stakeholders, including the environment, including future stakeholders. So imagine in a cap table, when you're designing a company and you're sharing the stock, not only sharing it among yourselves and the co-founders, but also with the users as giving them stock options. Imagine giving future children's stock options. It's a little bit different than Social Security or pension funds, where you have these pooled resources that you compete over. This is different. You're just assigning stock options. Instead of universal basic income, think about universal basic stakeholding. Think about giving the environment 5% of the company as a blind trust. So you're taking all those things that happen over time that become potentially externalities, the unintended negative consequences of a good work. But then by giving them stock options up front, if those issues arise, there is a blind trust that is automatically funded to take care of the follow-on work that's necessary to truly build a sustainable, equitable culture. So when you think about inequality, it happens because we're all kind of employees of this grand design. But imagine if we're all co-owners, then as the whole thing moves forward, stakeholders in this regard. So that's what inclusive stakeholding means, is that we are identifying and including all the stakeholders. We've tried this before with the United Nations, League of Nations, and a lot of the movements today are trying to figure out who the stakeholders are. The next step that we can all take is to actually give them a stake. We tend to think about giving stake to others as potentially, hey, it's a loss for us. But that's the kind of zero-sum game thinking that held us back from really doing this. If you think about the benefits to everybody of being inclusive, giving stock to others actually grows the whole pie. And not only does the whole system work better, it's a better form of capitalism, but as people and groups of people make great contributions, it pulls everybody forward together to the next great place. Now, I want to pause right there. Go ahead, Jenny.
Yeah, I was going to punctuate a little bit of that, and then I want to draw out some of the bigger picture thinking. So I originally had June in our conversation on stakeholder capitalism, because there is this trend from maximizing shareholder value towards stakeholder capitalism, and it actually kind of hit a tipping point last year when a lot of the major players in economics, like there's a group called the Business Roundtable that represents a lot of the major corporations in the U.S., the World Economic Forum, even Marco Rubio, all made statements about issues with shareholder models of the firm, which have really been dominant for the past 30 years. And reframing the purpose of the firm to be more than just making money for them and to be about all stakeholders. We had a conversation about that, but June's thinking is so much deeper and broader of that. And I want you to talk also about, because when we're talking about the cap table and giving equity, those are ways to entrench these concepts of stakeholder governance in the DNA, a stakeholder in the DNA of the firm. But you have some fascinating thoughts about kin relationships and why those broke down and how we might totally redesign incentives and kin relationships at scale. And I want to make sure that we hear that too.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. And one of the great innovations of nature is that nature actually understood inclusive stakeholding. We are a eusocial hive. We are meant to live together and pull each other forward together, but we didn't even need to think about doing it because it was designed into our genes. We have skin in the game in each other's lives when you think about our prehistoric past. We lived in tribes of, let's say, 100, 300. But because you had skin in the game in each other's lives, that was a genetic way of instantiating inclusive stakeholding. It was automatic. And when you look at the kindness people treat their own children, that was designed in by nature as an algorithm that was biologic. You didn't have to think about it. It was kind of automatic. It is our nature to nurture. It is so automatic. And that's what helped create this incredible world. But the way that ran over time through evolution was people were very loyal internally, but they were murderous externally to other tribes. And that wasn't the best model. As we went forward over time, we realized, okay, that's actually pretty brutal. And so we decided we're going to try to live together as a collective society. But because we no longer have skin in the game in each other's lives, we need a new way to instantiate what was automatic for us biologically in the past. So now the whole idea of feeding one's family, which was an amazing thing in the past, now leads to self-dealing, it leads to corruption. I mean, a lot of the nepotism, classic example, right? They're just applying skin in the game very narrowly. Take from others and give it to my kids, right? So we need something better. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that because I want to tie it to Burning Man. This is something I've been thinking a lot about lately. Because for me, Burning Man is just a mind-blowing experience when you first come and you drop transactions and you inhabit a gift economy. And it's so extraordinarily eye-opening that humans can behave this way at this scale. And it's so outside the bounds of any social interaction at that scale that you've ever seen that you had no idea that was possible. And what that makes me think of is okay, there's actually a much larger possibility set of human interactions, and we're just occupying a narrow one. And I was just reading this amazing book called Donut Economics that I highly recommend to everyone. We're actually covering it in the forum in 2 weeks. And what that was talking about, June, and this has been on my mind a lot in the last 2 weeks, is that when you put a price on something, you crowd out altruistic and intrinsic incentives. And there was this fascinating thing that she mentions in the book about a study where people answer the exact same questions with the exact same prompt. And when they were framed as a consumer versus a citizen, they answered far more selfishly in the subsequent questions. And so it's fascinating to me to think about how have our economic institutions as they currently stand essentially if you think about genetics and how certain environmental or epigenetic factors can upregulate or downregulate your genes, how are our institutions upregulating or downregulating certain aspects of human nature, right? And so this is what I'm wondering about, thinking deeply about it in terms of redesigning capitalism, even thinking deeply about it in terms of Dent as I think of, okay, it's this amazing thing right now because it's free, but if I have to fund it, how am I going to fund it without corrupting it? So
that's a very good point, right? So part of it is, we have these incentives that drive us. Sometimes it's biologics, sometimes it's social. And in this case that you're describing, it's actually, once it becomes institutional, we get conditioned to think that we should behave this way versus that way, that we have to focus on incentives here, but in this other domain, we're just like regular people. So all these things are both a little buggy, but they're also features. We can take all of this and really do something positive with it just by telling new stories and also building new institutions that are going to compete with the standard institutions. So for example, health insurance, right now it's a 1-year Tinder relationship. They give you a fee for service as a transaction. There's a price for it, like Jenny's describing here. But imagine instead if insurance got paid based on health savings 10 years down the road. So instead of getting paid on a 1-year fee for service, they're now an investor in your health. They're motivated to keep you healthy because they're getting paid a 5% of the stake of the health savings 10 years down the road. Same thing with teachers. Teachers are classic example of citizens, right?
What do they do?
They're not price takers, right? But imagine if teachers also got tokens in their children's, not like vast amounts, tiny amounts. But as let's say a kid makes a contribution later, 20 years later they win the Nobel Prize, then all the teachers get named. They're all stakeholders. So we all become investors in each other. We all become stakeholders in each other's lives, so that it pulls everybody forward. So we're actually, we just started a company, and maybe this may tie to a conversation that, a topic
Kevin,
that Kevin's
jump
gonna
in
cover.
anytime too, sorry.
Yeah, well, so we're starting a company called Low Stress Foods, and it's the idea that the standard model of capitalism is, profit efficiency, right? So McDonald's, amazing company in so many ways. They've done a lot of good, but also if you look at the experience of the stakeholders that don't have a stake in McDonald's, the animals and plants, they have very high levels of stress, and in our intuition, they have very high levels of stress hormones. If you look at in the supply chain, the animals have very high cortisol. They have diabetes, hypertension, obesity, just like us. And plants too are also experiencing very high degrees of stress, and their ethylene levels are very high. That's the stress hormone of plants. So now if you think about, could we design a different kind of company, a food company, that is inclusive, and we give them a stake. We give the animals and plants stock options through a blind trust, where they become the stewards for the experience of the animals and plants in all of our supply chain. Same thing with the environment. The way we eat today creates the externality of climate change. And this has been, a lot of people talk about this, but can we actually give stock into McDonald's, or McDonald's assign stock to a blind trust that helps deal with the environmental issues created by their company? Again, these are not good or bad people say. I think we're all in the same boat. We all have a blindness to the stakeholders we haven't seen. And if we wake up to it and help each other wake up to who they are and actually push out stock options to them, we can ingest them. So Low Stress Foods, the company that we're starting, the cap table includes all the potential stakeholders, including ones we can't think of, just a blind trust for the secondary effect and the externalities created by our company.
And can you explain what a blind trust is? Because I imagine some people probably don't know what that means.
Sure. Blind trust is, you can think about it as a foundation or an endowment, but as an endowment and with an independent board who will one day, let's say the company takes off and becomes a $1 billion company when that becomes a unicorn, then they would own 5% of a $1 billion company, this blind trust, as a foundation, whose board is independent and they're fully dedicated to deal with the consequences of the company itself. And it could be around climate, it could be around other stakeholders we didn't see. The idea is that it's an independent stakeholder and they have voting rights up front in the primary company. So they would have, a blind trust would have a voting rights, 5% voting rights in a company. Number one, they will economically benefit. So it's an automatic endowment. Their endowment is growing as the company grows. But more importantly, they have a voice today. They can teach us about, hey, you know what? Here's what's going on. And this board will speak to us and speak to our board. Here's an epiphenomenon of the work you're doing. Let's be considerate. Let's be mindful. Let's do better.
And this is an important example of, I like to say, like, transforming capitalism sounds sexy, and there's nothing sexy about details of the law and corporate governance, but that's kind of where the magic happens. But think about what happens right now, that the capital is extracted from companies by a very small group of individuals. And we talk about this in the public markets, and we talk about this as well in the startup space. And by thinking about who gets equity in the early stage, that allows a much broader set of actors to benefit from that and share that wealth, instead of what happens today, where it's like a few elite, Silicon Valley GPs and the LPs in their funds. But we talked about some like radical new models that actually totally rethink who owns the firm, where the firm is no longer owned by the investors, but it's owned by itself, and control is entirely held in stewards of the companies, and people who are investors just have economic rights. And so there's a lot of creativity that can happen in this corporate governance space. I don't want to get too much into it because it's kind of boring, but it is an important part of the conversation. And we are in our conversations in Den, like pushing entrepreneurs to open their eyes and think more creatively about what they might do. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you, Jenny. And I think that's all I have to say for today. And I do have to apologize and go. But I invite all of you to follow with Jenny and Kevin and the broader Den community, because I think this is a very exciting conversation that we'd love for all of you to be a part of. So thank you very much for having me today.
Thanks, June. Are you going to, you have to go? Yeah, you're taking off now,
I do have to go, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, I know. I'm sorry I was late. We lost precious time with you. Thank you so much for joining us. I know you're like in the middle of a weekend, and it was very generous of you to give us your time today. So I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Good day, everybody.
Kevin, how much VR experience do you have under your belt?
I'm a complete newbie. But
I can't hear you.
You can't hear me? Oh no.
Are you muted?
Let's see. I tried unmuting.
Is it just me?
Can anybody hear me? By chance? Anybody?
No, it's not just me.
No. Okay.
Sasha, maybe you can help Kevin on the tech, and I can give people more context into the transform capitalism theory of change. Or can you help him?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that he is re-entering the space.
Okay. So let me tell you guys, I was just mentioning how like the vision for Dent is just coming into focus. And this is what gets me most excited, because we have this community and it's incredibly heterogeneous. There are, storytellers and actresses and recording artists alongside venture capitalists and, the usual venture capitalists, entrepreneurs and nonprofit leaders, like all coming together, like professional athletes and influencers on social media, all with this shared desire to like have a sense of where we need to go from here and what their role is in it. And from the conversations, those opportunities, I think, naturally come out. It might be a cluster of people that are geeking out on what these new corporate governance models might look like and trying to influence that across Silicon Valley startups. It might be an opportunity to bolster. Oh, Kevin, are you here?
All right. Mic check. Can you hear me? No?
I still can't hear you. Well, I will ask you to interrupt me whenever you get back on mic, and then we'll take over. And the products that we choose to buy. And there are ways in which we don't realize that we are misaligned with our values, with the decisions that we make, and misaligned with the future that we want to move towards. And so what gets me the most excited is the notion that like we can start to have a sense of what that future looks like, and we can start to make these sort of deep, I think I hear you, Kevin. We can start making these deep personal changes, and we can all make them. Like, for me, a couple of years ago, I realized like I'm never buying a car that uses gasoline again. Like I'm buying cars that support what the future of cars look like. And there's all these little micro behavioral changes. And as you start to see them, I'm so excited about the notion of just like moving all the resources towards this new version. If the hopes, cross our fingers, we can kind of figure it out together over the course of the next months or years, or whoever knows how long it'll take. Kevin.
All right.
You got me? There you are. Yay. Yes.
All right.
Thank you for being here. I'm sorry that we haven't heard your voice until now. Me being late and June having to take off early, but
Quite all right. I always love hearing June. Very provocative, and I love it. He's at the forward edge of all this.
So why don't you tell us a
but
little bit
go
about
ahead.
your background in permaculture?
Yeah,
Because I
yeah.
bet most people here don't know what permaculture means.
Yeah, if for those of you who are new to the term permaculture, maybe even sharing my personal story or a piece of it might be helpful. When I was growing up, I lived in a place kind of known for two things, a kind of affluence and teenage suicide. I knew a number of people who ostensibly had all the things that material culture says you should want in terms of wealth and affluence, but they were just so depressed that life wasn't worth living. And so that brought up a lot of angst and anxiety in me. So I wanted to make, and I had some experiences where I was exposed to some of the environmental and ecosystemic degradation that was happening in the world as well. So I had this frame of mind of there's this social ecological crisis, and if only if people knew about it, we might change our behavior and change how we act and all of our habits and norms. So I moved to the Bay Area in the mid 90s, but I didn't have any money like my peers did. And I'm like, okay, how do you make movies? You must need money. And I was very naive. So I went and started technology companies and raised, somebody's giving me a signal that I raised my mic. Oops. Oh, give me a second. We'll do
What
that.
happened?
I'm trying. How about now? Is my mic volume better? Is that better?
Yeah, I'm able to hear you decently.
Okay.
He is quiet. He is quiet by nature. That's our Kevin.
Okay. Well, I'll try and speak up if that's helpful. Okay. So when I moved to the Bay Area, so I started some companies, some software enterprises focusing on IP telephony, and raised venture capital, hired dozens or hundreds of people, and made some money, but never made the movies that I wanted to make to try and communicate, which was so urgent to me. And I started getting very depressed in a very scary spot. And friends actually introduced me to, they took me out to a farm and said, hey, maybe there's a different way to express yourself. And I met some of the brightest people that I've had the privilege to meet. And they introduced me to permaculture design. And talk about transforming oneself. I sold the house that I had purchased. I sold my car, radically simplified my life, left the last company that I started, and started learning how to grow food with my own hands, harvest rainwater, make structures with my own hands, and a deep dive into ecosystemic design and kind of local self-reliance living, and learned the pedagogy of permaculture design, a design system. And along the way, by the mid 2000s, I recognized some things about permaculture, which is I don't have to go into right now, but I wanted to make permaculture relevant and accessible to people living in cities. And I found that a lot of the strategies, the techniques and strategies that one might associate with permaculture design, this would be, maybe some of you are familiar with things like natural buildings, like straw bale buildings that sequester carbon, or all your diversified renewable energy and passive building techniques, growing food with perennial agriculture or food forests, or low maintenance, high yielding ways of producing agricultural yields that actually enhance and regenerate the environment and increase biodiversity and soil health while generating a material economic yield. All of those techniques and strategies of permaculture design, a lot of them were difficult to see in expression. They exist in little pieces around the world, but the big barrier in most cases is it doesn't conform well with the norms of capitalism. And so in the mid 2000s, I started something called the Urban Permaculture Institute, and started teaching with some of my permaculture allies who are normally teaching out in the rural environment, a woman named Starhawk and others. And we started looking at the intersections between permaculture design and the economy. And I wanted to maybe bridge from where June and Jenny were just talking about these governance structures, and share how the work of the principles and ethics of permaculture design are intersecting these economic spaces. I'll name one or two examples. I'll start with one. How many of you are familiar with the idea of the American bison? Right. So, by show of emoji, does anybody know the story of the American bison? The story of the American bison, essentially, you have to look at the genocide of the indigenous peoples on this continent in the time of colonialism. The genocide of the Oglala Lakota and a number of the tribal peoples in the savanna and the grasslands of what we call the breadbasket of the world, the Midwest of the United States. They were cultures that co-evolved with the American bison. And in order to facilitate the genocide of a people, there was a directive to actually eliminate the American bison. And anybody who's ever been maybe to Yellowstone National Park, or if you've ever seen a bison, these are large animals. And at the beginning of, say, the 19th century, there were hundreds of thousands, maybe as many, depending if you take the whole continent, as many as 50 million bison. And by the end of the 19th century, it was down to a few thousand animals. So the scope of what that genocide looks like in terms of its impact on the environment is horrific, tragic. So there's an organization called Native American Natural Foods that was started on the Pine Ridge Reservation. If you're not familiar with the Pine Ridge Reservation, it's about the size of the state of Connecticut, but it's in South Dakota. And it's the second most impoverished place in the Western Hemisphere. Only Haiti would compare. The average adult lifespan is about 46 years. And the average family income, annual income, is about $6,000 US. It's a huge area and extraordinarily food insecure. And the Oglala Lakota people came together and said, our health is determined by the health of the bison, and we need a way to facilitate repatriating the American bison to the short and long grass prairies of Pine Ridge and the other reservations in the Dakotas in that area. So they started a company called Native American Natural Foods, but from a corporate governance standpoint, we helped them create a triumvirate of organizations. There's a nonprofit called the Tonka Fund. There's a for-profit called Native American Natural Foods, which is associated with Tonka Bar, and then an associated product. And then there's a third organization, which is a producer cooperative called Tonka Resilient Agriculture. And I know this is maybe getting in the weeds and probably maybe pretty boring, but the insight that I wanted to share is the company actually took an ancient technology called pemmican, where you can preserve bison meat and make it a shelf-stable product. And they started selling it and developed a national following and national distribution. A portion of all those sales goes to the Tonka Fund, which helps indigenous ranchers develop land tenure rights and fencing to be able to repatriate bison to the reservations. And then the producer cooperative provides the guaranteed supply chain to Native American Natural Foods. The design of that organization and its reciprocity arrangements is very much akin to what June is describing, of involving the stakeholders, including the bison themselves. This is where the insight, again, way too many details, but bison require time for their herds to grow. So if you use only market dominant forces, the bison herds would never grow on the reservations and never be able to preserve and actually enhance the carbon cycling function of the short and the tall grass prairie. So here you have a company selling products now nationwide, the Tonka bars, which actually regenerate, enhance, and restore the biodiversity and sequester carbon in the largest carbon sink in the Midwest, which is the short and long grass prairie of our reservation systems. And it's a beautiful structure, but it is actually really boring, I think, to name it.
Well, it okay, this is totally just me, but it's like these Dent conversations are a magnet for the most unbelievable people. So I feel like we're already one of the best badass teams on the planet to tackle some really hard stuff. I had a conversation on Friday with the guy who is the general counsel at Omidyar Network, here Omidyar's foundation, who's one of the founders of eBay, and I was like doing cartwheels that he was part of the network because he geeks out on this stuff. So it's not for everybody, but it's important. It's really where the rubber meets. But I wanna kind of put what Kevin's talking about in the context of the broader inquiry in a couple of three different ways. One is that like permaculture and this notion of like how do we create structures that are regenerative is an essential component of it, and it's something that we'll be talking about in about a month, and Kevin's going to be our guest to really dig into that. So we have one conversation a week that's a deep dive, and we take a topic and I send out homework totally optional, and then we go over it. So the hope is that you can come out of that session with like, okay, I get permaculture reasonably well. So permaculture is a really important piece of the puzzle to understand at a micro level, and then we're going to have a conversation about regenerative capitalism and how that scales up. I'm trying to put this all in context. I'm not trying to advertise. And then the second thing you talked about, which is really important, is this notion of the indigenous practices, right? And I feel like a lot was lost. So looking at indigenous cultures and asking what did we lose and what can we learn and embed in new institutional structures is another really important part of the inquiry. And then the other thing that you said that's critical is what I just mentioned, was this notion of like embodiment and alignment. So there's social entrepreneurs out there that are doing companies. Like there's a great example is like, a company that, I don't know, I'm assuming like Impossible Meats and Beyond Foods are probably good examples of companies that, are doing good in the world, but they have traditional corporate structures, and those traditional corporate structures allocate the vast majority of the gains to only a few people. And that's not full alignment and embodiment with the version of capitalism that we need to move to in the future. And so like having that embodiment and alignment all the way down into the DNA of companies is a really important piece of the puzzle that I'm just hoping that people will start to see as we continue these conversations. Well, Kevin, maybe you can, I unfortunately am not too steeped in the permaculture side of things yet because we're not doing it for a couple weeks, but right. Maybe you could tell us just a little bit more about the regenerative agriculture space. Seems to be like the most advanced sort of broader regenerative capitalism space. Can you just elucidate for me awareness and adoption of the practices globally?
Yeah. So when we say regenerative agriculture, one thing to note is there's a bit of, I think, semi-embarrassing semantic warfare as to what does regenerative actually mean. But we can generally agree on a basic frame that if you, for example, were to yield food from primary production, whether you're growing food or fiber or timber for building materials, you're doing an agricultural activity. The health of the soil, the watershed, and the biodiversity, the richness of life, alpha and omega biodiversity of a place, is affected by that agricultural activity. And a lot of conventional business as usual agriculture has laid waste to landscapes and desecrated watersheds and vastly diminished the biodiversity and the life-carrying capacity of our earth in extraordinarily detrimental ways when you look at the overall impact on our climate cycles. So the climate impacting cycles, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle. So agriculture actually, as we do it in humans in a conventional business as usual sense, has a outsized and horrific impact. So that would be a degradation type of agriculture. Now, is it possible to achieve growing food, for example, in ways that actually keep the soil health and the biodiversity sustained at its current levels? That would be sustainability, right? And we do for many years with the organic movement coming out of in the U.S. largely in the 70s and through the 80s to today, as well as the organic movement, and then sustainable agriculture became a fundable topic. Even the USDA recognized it as a concept. That's sustaining, But like Jenny is alluding to, this idea of sustaining something that's already in a degraded state is actually categorically wholly inadequate for the task of our moment. In order to regulate the hydrologic cycle and the climate cycle and actually build a resilient possible future for humanity, we're at a point where we need to move to this idea of actually regenerative agriculture. So the basic idea, without going into the details of the semantic disagreements, if we can grow food in ways that actually increase soil fertility, increase biodiversity, and increase watershed health while yielding food, then we would say, oh my gosh, year over year or season after season, the actual fecundity, the life-carrying capacity of this place is actually increasing. Now, of the techniques and strategies that regenerative agriculture might imply, there's a whole diversity of them. Some of the major themes and some of the names you might have heard. Major themes is actually involving perennial vegetation like trees, woody perennials into agriculture, which is dominated by annual crops in terms of arable crop agriculture, especially in North America or Western Europe. This idea of involving trees and integrating trees or perennials into the system has a numerous set of benefits in terms of nutrient management, carbon cycling, biodiversity, and other impacts. And there's a number of techniques that specific techniques that you may have heard of. Some of you, a lot of these are documented in a project that I'm still a senior research fellow of called Project Drawdown. And Project Drawdown published a book in April of 2017, where it documents a series of practices and strategies, including a number around land use and agriculture. But some of the terms you may have heard of: tree intercropping, silvopasture, and even conservation tillage. These are kind of on a spectrum from those that move from sustaining or partially regenerating, just a little bit less bad, to those like multi-strata agroforestry, which is a technique that would be used especially in our equatorial zones or our tropical climate zones, is something that has an incredible set of cascading benefits. And so, Jenny, the question, how prevalent, where are we at with these things? Conservation tillage is now applied in the scale of tens of millions of hectares. So this is not a boutique, barely applied strategy, but that's on the early edge of less bad. If you go into the deeper integrated strategies that we would associate with a broad term like agroforestry, you're in the millions of hectares globally, but mostly in diversified smallholder environments, 2 hectares or less, which, for what it's worth, over 50% of the world's food is produced by smallholder farmers on acreages of 2 hectares or less. So just good to, when we think of agriculture or farming in the United States, our perspective could be very skewed just because of the nature of corporate agriculture.
So let me ask you,
you're in millions of hectares. Is the short.
Yeah. And then presumably there is just significant policy barriers to the implementation that we want to see because of corporate capture of governments around the world by the big ag companies.
Yeah. I mean, go ahead.
No, keep going.
Okay, I was gonna say a couple directions to look at. Why is it not normal to have no-till cover crop with windbreaks, woody windbreak type of carbon farming agriculture with integrated managed grazing? Why isn't that normal? Why isn't it everywhere? Well, it turns out that the distortions of the food system from an economic perspective through subsidy and some actual perverse regulation are designed into the system to, one, misprice risk. So right now we're suffering from a bad model in terms of understanding the risk of catastrophic climate change, flood and fire, extreme storm events. It's totally mispriced. And in a climate change future, that would need to change because regenerative agriculture creates a more resilient landscape, and that's totally unaccounted for. And then, of course, the gross subsidy of poor practice is actually a major barrier. If we just shifted the subsidy into better practices right there, that would be more than significant.
And this is a perfect example of why our inquiry around reforming capitalism has to look broader than just economics. I mean, particularly over the last 30 or 40 years, companies have increasingly captured governments by virtue of lobbying and campaign finance. And I read a stat. We're yet to do the campaign finance conversation, and I'm looking forward to that. But like lobbying used to be equal among various stakeholders, and now it's like outspent 34-1 by companies. And so like you're never going to get the structural changes to the economy without the government getting involved, and the government incentives are just completely screwed right now. So like unwinding that, thinking through unwinding that piece of the puzzle is definitely going to be fun. Maybe I wanted to give us a chance to open it up to Q&A. Yeah, that's what I was just saying. I just gotta, yeah, absolutely. Let's do Q&A. That's what I was just saying as I got an event from Druffin. So can you help me make that happen? How do we enable that? Click to raise your hand.
There you go.
Somebody can click to raise their hand.
Yeah, so if someone's got a question, go ahead and use your hand raise, and then I will give you the microphone. Good guys, 5. Go ahead.
Give a question over.
So, how difficult do you think that it would be to change the current economic model from a Pareto distribution to some other distribution?
Hey, Bina, I'm sorry, my daughter's calling me. I'm still doing my event, sweetheart. How difficult would it be? I mean, we're still getting a handle on it. I have cared primarily about this problem for the last decade. And part of what the pandemic offered was an opportunity to really do the deep and broad inquiry that's required to have a good answer to that question. And part of the thinking and the reason that we're doing these convenings is just we spend so much time with our heads down, jumping from meeting to meetings every day, that we really want to better understand the world, but it's just extraordinarily hard to motivate and find the time to do it. And so like I have a theory of change around honing in on what that looks like, and that kind of the strategy to get there will become clear, hopefully, to me over the course of the next, I don't know, I want to say 6 months. But I do think that this underlying notion of like, that Buckminster Fuller quote about you don't change the system itself, but you start something alongside it. You start something alongside it, and you hold on a sec. Hey guys. This is motherhood. This is well, my children have always wanted to go to Burning Man. We actually were really tempted to take him to Baker Beach yesterday, but sorry about that. So like the strategy is not totally clear to me, but the underlying kind of sense of how we get there is this Buckminster quote, that like you don't change the system by trying to move it, but you define the new system and you move resources to it, right? So if we can define what it looks like, can we drive resources in terms of employees and consumers and investors towards that new system to disadvantage the old system? I think that's the theory of change. How hard is it going to be? I think it's going to be extraordinarily hard, because it is almost certainly going to involve very deep paradigm shifts from a values perspective. Like not valuing more, which is so deep into our culture, not valuing wealth, which is so deep in our culture. And those would be really tough and interesting conversations. And honestly, that's why I'm so excited about all the artists in our community and the role that they play in that piece of the puzzle. But it's a very hard question to answer in any reasonable way. But I invite you to come join us over the next 6 months till the end of time to try to figure it out.
Yeah.
Do we have more questions?
Oh yeah. That was a good one. Synchronic, you're up next.
Hi.
Hi, where are you?
Hi. I'm to your right, on the very edge of the carpet. Synchronicity Sky. And my work and my organization focuses on flow and synchronicity, and studying the ways that synchronicity actually is possibly a scientific phenomenon that can change the way we think about our choices. And when the other day, Amanda talked from Buckminster Fuller Institute, and we brought up grief. We talked about grief and the role of grief
Yeah.
in helping us transform. And
Yeah.
the theme of this camp is transform yourself and change the world.
Yeah.
What really strikes me is coming back to what Kevin was just saying about accurately pricing risk.
Yeah.
Is it true that those decisions are made in a boardroom by a collection of individuals? And if those individuals had the skills to properly tap into the motivation of whatever's driving them, to address, to feel the loss, to feel things at a deeper level. I see an individual change that ripples throughout society from the bottom up. What do you see that as a useful function?
I have some thoughts there. Kevin, do you want to weigh in first?
Sure. I think there's both and at play. Whereas there are, I think, important decisions that a collection of individuals make. Whereas today, a number of those decisions are isolated from the potential. There's a crisis of the imagination of what's possible, or just an ignorance or a lack of sense making that could influence different decisions that could have a dramatically different set of outcomes. I simultaneously see that there are actual structures, both either legal or operational, and there are some cultural norms that are larger than any one individual's decisions, or even a, say, small collection of individuals who have some amount of power. And those limits, if you will, the constraints of the systems need to be addressed kind of simultaneously with supporting the transformational potential for individuals to actually develop enough resilience to both see the hurt and the grief and move through that, and then see the beauty of what's possible, this expansion of the imagination. Right now, our culture, as a cultural note, if you're an idealist, usually it's almost like a pejorative term. Like it's almost like an insult to call somebody an idealist. It means they're not real. And I think we have a huge, we've atrophied our muscle of imagination to really even dream of what's possible, maybe for fear of being called Pollyannish or idealist. But there is in my personal experience, there's a crisis of imagination. That's why I love Jenny and Dent, for what it's worth. I feel like I'm plugging Dent. But it's returning to those principles is so important.
Yeah. We can't. Yeah, I mean, it's such an enormous question that I'm just trying to pluck it into little pieces of the puzzle. So I just keep trying to put each conversation in the context of the broader inquiry. So a couple of different things. One thing that your question makes me think of, and sorry for the background noise, guys. Is I don't know if you guys have heard of Daniel Schmachtenberger, but if you haven't, you're in for a treat. He is one of the, we got some hearts back there. He's a wonderful human, and one of the, he will blow your mind with how much he knows and how thoughtful he is and how much he will pack into a sentence. And there's a YouTube video that I would highly encourage all of you to watch called The War on Sense Making. And it talks about something called the epistemic crisis, which is essentially that it's hard for us to make sense of the world because our sources of information have the wrong incentives. Ad-based media, the corporations trying to sell us something, science funded, skewed towards things that can be commercialized. All that then gets filtered through a social media lens that has, propagates things that engage our attention, that are not necessarily the things that we want. And we're at the point that we don't even know what's real anymore. And then the whole system can get weaponized. And so it's a hugely clarifying video on that, but he says something. So this is one of the must consume pieces of content that I tell for everyone to understand the world right now. But one of the things he says in that video that I thought was so fascinating and I really took with me was that he used to think that it was the current system just had the wrong incentives. And now what he's come to believe is it's actually inducing sociopathic behaviors. And so when you talk about the people in the boardroom and whether they have the right understanding, the boardroom has a certain distance from the constituents that it affects, and even more distant are the shareholders with the voting rights that are they don't understand that when you're laying off lots of people, what that does to their lives. And so co-ops, when you're closer to the humans that you affect, like kind of bring forth that empathy. And I think the point I made earlier around like how do we design institutions that upregulate the better parts of human nature and downregulate the worst? It's an incredibly complicated question, but I want to keep asking it. And then the second thing that I thought of in your question is this notion, this like very fundamental notion, and we're actually about to have this conversation in 2 weeks of just governance, which is just simply how do humans work together to make sense of the world, decide what to do, and then do it. And what happens when you try to do that at various scales. And I feel like it's a very foundational conversation because you can't design society unless you can like, understand those dynamics. And I don't know, have any of you guys heard of Clubhouse? I know some of you have, but not a lot of you have. So we're actually having these conversations on a brand new social app called Clubhouse. And it's fascinating because it allows us to have conversations and come into the room and engage in a way that social media has not to date. And it's actually enabling sense making. So that was kind of a long-winded answer to your question. I don't know if it like adequately answered your question, but I think it points to like a couple of different systemic dynamics that can start to address it. Anybody else have a question?
Very important to current world state, like largely addressing governance. And we're talking about governance not just within a application, but within the privacy settings. And that's where we're addressing governance. It's huge, and it's not just in California, but it's global. Addressing privacy standards within our digital products, meaning turning on and off. It's huge.
Yeah, and a really big conversation that Jamie Daves, who's been also like one of the most involved people in the conversation since day one, and this is another conversation that I want to have, is around like the consumer assets that we produce and what would happen if we took back control of our data. What would that do to the dynamics within the system? So he's working on that right now, first in health, but it's just kind of astounding the personal data that we give away and how valuable it is, and the opportunity to manipulate society when that falls into the wrong hands, which we've already also seen.
Looks like we have another question. Or did you want to weigh in on that, Kevin? We have
I can barely hear you too.
Oh, sorry. I'm not amplified. There you go. Now you can hear me nice. Nicerly. Go ahead.
Oh, where's that voice coming from?
I don't know. It can hear you.
What's going on?
I know.
Somebody
did you have
talking.
a question?
Yeah, I just got confused because somebody was someone's mic is up.
Can I just pause to admire your avatar game? Because it's really, really impressive.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I just went. I used to be all pink, but that was in the old days where you could hack the DLL on the avatar. And this is just, I just have the ugliest guy I could possibly come up with.
Oh, it's really impressive. My kids were so excited to do my avatar, and then I was sprinting to do it, but we'll have a really awesome one next time. I'm sorry for interrupting. It's just, it's so amazing. I just had to acknowledge it.
Okay, thanks. I'm glad you like it. I don't know what it is. Maybe I missed it in the beginning, but I just kind of wanted some background on your economics background.
Oh, sure.
I guess everybody, Kevin and you as well. That's all.
Yeah, of course. I guess I didn't give you guys my background. To some extent, I often it's obviously pertinent, but I do almost like to avoid my resume and just have people be people. The identity that's focused on like what we've accomplished, part of the problem. But I'm happy to give you context. I do think that's so my background is in a lot of different things. Me to look at this from various angles. I did strategy very early in my career. I spent 4 years at Google in 2004, 2008, when it grew very large. And then I left and got my master's degree in international development and economics from the Kennedy School. And I did mention that in the introduction. And so I was just far more passionate about these macro questions than the micro ones. And I had been reading books about international development in my spare time for years, but I felt like you really needed to understand the language of economics to even have a seat at the table. And then we did the degree. I did the degree, and I loved every second of it on the one hand, and on the other hand, it felt like wholly inadequate. We never questioned what is human development and how does economic growth get us there. It was just kind of like full speed ahead. This is how you make economies grow. This is how we raise like 1 billion people out of poverty. Let's keep doing that. We even never talked about behavioral economics. And it was clear that the incentives of our current economic institutions were broken. So that's my background in economics. I will add that I also, what does that sound? There's like a little digital bee buzzing around my head. Does anybody else hear that? That's just me. And then I did and I think this is really important in terms of looking at the world. You can hear it too. I'm gonna try to blaze through it. I did a fellowship at the D School at Stanford. And I think that the ability to look at these problems from a 30,000 foot systems view, as well as a human-centered view, and think about what like iterative implementation would look like, is kind of part of.
Yeah, you can all. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I have a background in kind of on the enterprise side of having started companies and raised capital all the way and managed a company all the way through to exit, and then later had the opportunity to, in terms of applied economy, work on the investor side of the equation of capital formation and allocating across different asset classes in investment. And that's all micro scale, where, you know, I've developed an appreciation for the barriers and limitations of some of the macro environment. And then my fellowship as a senior fellow for Project Drawdown from 2014 to 2017 worked as a senior financial fellow on essentially a modeling and analysis on all the various strategies and technologies that could be adopted in terms of their global potential adoption and the addressable market there. And I created a financial model to compare very heterogeneous type practices and strategies in the world, and in that way had to interface with the macroeconomic environment, which was a steep learning curve and decidedly not institutionally academic, but nonetheless I got to meet some of the brighter institutional economists that I've ever met in the world in that role.
Yeah, you know, and economists are evolving. You know, funny enough, some of my professors from the Kennedy School have now put together a network of economists for inclusive prosperity, and they have a paper, and I kind of want to read it and do a conversation on like, what are the economists thinking? It seems to be more geared towards addressing inequality than it is like environmental degradation. But and I have a feeling like the academic economists just tend to like just be a little bit. They're just too specialized. I mean, this is something, it sounds like some of you were at Amanda's talk earlier in the week. I've actually been working with BFI for most of this year. Economists just like, Bucky talked about just, he lamented the over-specialization in the world. And I think this is what happens, especially in academia. You're just like so incredibly narrow in your tiny little esoteric corner of like, you know, the knowledge frontier. You don't see the big picture, and that absence of like, you know, interdisciplinary thinking is part of what's missing, and part of what is the beauty of what we're doing in the Den conversations, because we're combining people from so many different perspectives, which is helpful not just for the sense making piece, but also, essential for innovation. That was always the secret sauce at the D school, that we had classes where you had the business school student with the PhD, with the med student, all in the same team, and those different frames allowed you to come up with more innovative ideas. Any other questions? It's freeform now, so I don't know what that means. Do you just speak? I don't think I have to call on you. I think you just speak.
Go for it.
Yeah. Do I have to do something?
Oh, yeah.
Did I pick you? Sorry, I'm just add friend message. Does anybody know how to do this?
I'm not sure. I wish I could help.
He said it's freeform, but oh no, I'm sad too. Can't you just turn your mic on? Host tools. Oh, wait a minute. There's some host tools. Go on air, toggle mute all. I'll figure it out, guys. Just give me a second. Don't toggle stage blocker, host panel. Host toggle. Does that work?
Ah,
Is that
there you
doing
go. Finally.
Oh, it did something. We figured it out. Okay.
Yeah. No, I was just gonna say, I think that the audio's coming from these.
Oh, you're also in the tropical rainforest?
No, I think the audio's coming from these bots right here.
Okay.
It's coming from that one.
Such a surreal experience, guys. Did you have another question?
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say that I think the audio's coming from these bots.
Oh.
This.
Do you want them to go away?
Yeah, I don't know. I hear sound coming from somewhere, and I think it's coming.
Yeah, there's a whole conversation
Is
happening.
it also
in
the tropical
background.
rainforest sound? Or am I the
I
only
mean,
one that's in the rainforest?
A little bit.
No, someone's having a discussion about.
Someone's having a whole conversation. At
Yeah,
the
someone
phone.
monitoring it doesn't know their headsets on, and we're hearing their whole conversation.
Oh, bummer. And I don't know how to make that go away.
Can somebody with hands pick it up and move it to another part of the room?
Wait, maybe we can hear you. Let me try this. I'm gonna try something. This is such a Burning Man moment.
For
I don't
real.
know how much of you guys are burners, but
It's someone with admin
Well,
permission,
hold up a
because
sign,
they're
hold up a
overruling.
sign so that
well,
I don't
I
have
just
any
pointed.
hands.
I pointed to the bot and sent a message, and said we can hear you. It's coming from that one.
Thanks. Holy fucking shit, right?
Holy fucking shit! That's what I just heard. Can I kick him? I can kick him. I don't know. Do you think we can power through it? Or do you guys want to close?
Yeah, it's all right. No, it's all right.
It's fine.
There's a whole discussion on the side of everything that's being said.
Yeah,
I'm
that's hard.
messaging-
That's
I'm
hard. Your
messaging them
brain's
right now,
having a hard
too.
time. We lost our tech support. So, does anyone else have any questions? Or is that too hard to see through that?
you could move to the other side of the room. Fine.
Do you go to the other? Oh, should we move? Should we try to go over there? Do you think it'll be better if we just move to the other side of the room? You want to try?
Let's try.
Let's try it. Oh wait, I need to get my other headphone. This is a total Burning Man moment.
I did send those guys a message earlier, but no one answered. Like to turn.
That's
off
better.
Yeah, I did
Yeah,
too.
so-
I did too.
Oh, they
Okay,
just
where
messaged
should
me
we go?
back and they muted themselves. Did you hear me?
I replied, "Thank you, and we love you."
Hot, smoky Sunday in San Francisco.
So,
You hear me, Jay?
apparently
Yeah, totally.
all the smoke likes to just hang out right in front
The
of
bot came with us.
all the smoke. All
I
the
still
smoke.
hear a
So
conversation.
literally, all the smoke
But it's better, right?
my house.
Yeah.
Do you guys
No.
have any questions?
Oh, it's still following us around. I see. Hello.
Which of
so
our
many
values?
questions.
They're following us around.
but I missed the first half, so I don't know.
I think it's
That's okay. Well, I'll tell you guys a really cool idea I had once. And what's that?
This is like an episode of Black Mirror.
And we're gonna be stuck here, guys.
I've heard that today from someone on Playa.
Well, it's cool to be on the playa. But I had this idea. Have any of you guys heard of Further Future? Remember when Robot Heart did like the Further Future kind of offshoot? People would be like, "I'm going to the future. I'll see you on Tuesday," and they sent these like provocations to people like, "Don't wear your playa clothes, wear your future clothes," and that really provoked this idea of like, what would your future alter ego look like? You know, because you kind of have an alter ego at Burning Man, but if you thought about like how would your alter ego interact and behave and be different in the future you want to imagine, which got me thinking about like what if the whole event could be a prototype for the future, and instead of having people talk to you about the future, you could just be in it. And I was really pushing them towards that model, and unfortunately they and again, considering all the embodiment stuff I was talking about, I actually got them to convert the org to a public org. And I was like, where are the women on your executive team? But I love that idea of like actually going in and embodying a future for a weekend. And I'm still like holding on to it, and I'm thinking about it if we ever do in-person events. But I actually then was like, well, wait a minute. What if the Dent community and the way the Dent community interacts with the org could feel like that? And in some ways, I think it almost feels like that now, because it's this incredible thing that started off as just me, Zoom salons for my friends, and is now hundreds of people coming together, and people are like thanking me every week for bringing the conversations to them, like in a way that is selfless, and the generosity is just flowing back in the other directions, and it feels in many ways like Playa. You know, it's like I need help figuring out how to structure. Well, there's the like Bureau Midyar's lawyers there. Oh, and like I want to build a job board, and the guy that has a startup that builds a job board that goes right into my website is part of Dent and is so stoked to help. And like the list has just gone on. And then I'm like, wait a minute, could like our community feel like that? Like, can we steep values in it and in the way that we interact with each other that could emulate that future? Is what's on my mind this week, and I think in some ways it does, and I want to like aspire to do that, because part of what we're doing is we have like elevated, diverse voices in civic discourse all week long, and I feel like we lost that when media got fragmented. And when we started, and part of the problem is just like we work so damn hard and we're in meetings all day, and at the end of the day we like chill out and watch Netflix, and we can't make sense of the news, and so like there's not an insufficient understanding in civic discourse that happens all the time, and so that might be even like the nucleus of Dent and its theory of change, is that we're just like a community that is having those deep conversations all the time. But anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent. But if anybody has questions, otherwise I could tell you about a really cool conversation that we're going to have on Tuesday.
That wasn't
you guys.
That was the most poignant thing that I've heard, and
wait. Sorry, what were you saying?
I said it was not a tangent. That was one of the most poignant things that I've heard spoken, and maybe a year. Please
Thank you.
This new conversation.
What's that? Oh yes. Okay, so you guys are going to be so excited because guess who's coming to Dent on Tuesday? Will Rogers, who is one of the founders of Burning Man. He was on the chair board for a long time. Marion is excited about it. She hasn't confirmed, but she might also be there too. So it was just like, okay, it's the Tuesday after Burning Man. It's perfect timing. So we're going to have this conversation about like, what can we learn from Burning Man? Because Burning Man is clearly a bubble, and it's a bubble that only is enabled within the context of this institutional structure that we want to change. And one of my friends said recently, really cracked me, like, Burning Man's powered by China. So there's pieces of Burning Man that we want to take with us, and there's pieces that we don't, and that's the conversation that I want to have. I want us to kind of dig into the 10 principles and think it through that lens, and then have this conversation with Will, and hopefully also Marion, and there's so many burners in the community, so I'm just really excited about what the conversation would look like, even just amongst us. I want to get our gears turning on that, and I feel like Kevin. I want to be drawing you into the conversation more, but okay. So then I'll tell you guys an amazing story because this is kind of crazy. So. June, about 18 months ago, and he told me he has this amazing practice where every night at sunset he walks the labyrinth in his backyard, and he has probably like 60 or 70 people that he envisions. Like he's a little bit like, he's not a little bit, he's a fair amount woo-woo, and he talks, he like envisions their faces and he sends them energy. And then on the back end of it, it's so cute, he's like in his 80s, he sends 3 emojis to those people. It kind of like closes the loop that he's like, they're in his meditation and they send him like psychic energy. And I was like honored when he sent me one after we met, and I integrated it into my meditation practice every morning. And so it's like a rotating cast of, for me, maybe a dozen people in my life who are facing some sort of challenges. And so when they start to face the challenge, I integrate them in my practice, and then I send them the emojis and they get them every day. And so Will and I have 18 months of daily emojis in the morning and in the evening, and we still do it, but we have never spoken. And so it's gonna be a total trip to like, oh my god, there's a person with a voice on the other side of the screen that we're gonna have a conversation with. So that's gonna be pretty cool. But yeah, so you guys should come. So it sounds like a lot of you guys don't know Clubhouse. So you guys can go to the website. It's denttogether.org. And you can sign up for the mailing list. And then I need to like send you guys Clubhouse invites with your phone numbers, which is a slightly involved process, but I have as many Clubhouse invites as Dent needs. So if you want to come to that, I of course would love to have you. And we just need to get you signed up before Tuesday at 5 p.m. It seems like we're good. I mean, I'm happy to keep answering questions. And Kevin, you're welcome to stay. You're welcome to go.
2 words to Will Rogers and nacho cheese.
Nacho cheese?
Nacho cheese. Yes, 2 words. Will Rogers, Crimson Rose, nacho cheese.
Okay.
Well, they understand. They know it. They had nacho cheese for their wedding, and they live in the Pyramid.
Well, I hope you guys got something out of that conversation.
It's super fun. Please invite me to the event on Tuesday. I don't know if I'll be able to make it because I'm gonna have to work. But absolutely.
I record them and make them available by request to the community.
That would be super awesome. Super awesome. I do have some nacho cheese. I got the vegan version for sure for the burns.
That's right.
I was
That's
worried
right.
about lactose intolerance, and anyway, so I have the vegan nacho cheese this year. It's always the entire burn really is about nacho cheese.
Okay.
You know what I'm talking about. You know what I'm talking about. Ask me about the nacho cheese.
I will.
It's kind of like the entire world can be like revolted around the nacho cheese. And where the
Okay.
nacho cheese is and how it tastes and is it vegan or not vegan.
This is a busy Sunday. We have I like, it's so funny, like the emojis instead of clapping. This is so fascinating to me. It's so cool. Kevin, have you ever had a virtual speaking engagement before?
No.
It's a first.
This is the first.
Yeah, the first thing I say, like literally the first 3 words on the Dent website is Dent is an experiment. That designer lens, we're always trying something new. So yeah, we can try virtual stuff. You never know what's gonna resonate. It's been really fascinating. I don't know if I've talked to you about this, Kevin, but the last 2 weeks ago, people kept saying, "What's your vision?" And I'm like, I like that it didn't even occur to me to write a vision until last week. It was like it just emerged. It just emerged on its own, and the balance was so heavily on just like witnessing it as it was like revealing itself to me, instead of like having the grand vision that I'm like, you know, inserting into. Designed. It's like the strategy mind provides the theory of change in the container.
But bringing a product being a product, meaning a brand. But bringing a product being a brand is just like something that is I've like heavily protected over my years. Burn was in 1996, and in the Burning Man brand, and I somehow I got like caught up in this whole user experience of the Burning Man experience, right? And it's I mean, it's been like 25 years of my life, literally.
Yeah.
That the Burning Man brand is something that I've been like thinking about operating, and like somehow, like even though I move in and out of the Burning Man experience, there's always a little part of me that has Burning Man in my back pocket.
Yeah.
I had official invites. Like I can officially invite you virtually to the Burning Man experience. I did that for 10 years in New York City. I threw the anymore, but the Burning Man brand it's very important. That is something that I keep like near and dear to my heart. And of itself, that it can't segue to that.
Yeah, I think they've faced some really tricky challenges in like, you know, maintaining it while decentralizing it. You know, because obviously, like, if you want to affect serious change, you have to decentralize. But doing it with care.
Decentralization, because I'm really tired of the libertarians like decompartmentalizing it, because they actually they have completely splintered the entire like nation. Meaning that I don't think that the splinter of where libertarians is working at all in the United States. Meaning that libertarians taking this whole like we're not people stating at all well. We still need to pay taxes, and we still need to have people involved in this. People involved is needs to mute.
Oh, it's just what are what?
All right, so I don't think the libertarians are really doing this as service as Americans. And this is the difference between being American and being American and being world. But I don't absolutely love what the libertarians, aka the Republicans, aka Trump has done with the country. And pretty much 130,000%, no one in this audience is also saying that. But I was also at the playa when we elected Obama, and I was also in the playa when we elected Trump. So the thing is, what people generally use this like mental brain tree of is to change the government and change the world. And I mean, maybe the multiverse is still a good place to do that, but then
maybe what is still a good place to do that?
Well, I'm hoping that the multiverse is still a good place. We can still change the government. We can still change the United States, because it has been, Burning Man has been consistently one of these places where we can transform the world, right? I mean, consistently over the years, in the 25 years that I've been to the Burning Man, it has been a place where we can, always the Saturday night is transformational. And
I know. I know.
Sunday
I
you
was
wake
really.
up with I'm in a new place. I'm in a new place. The transformation happens. I walked through a portal into the portal, and I almost kind of feel like this portal is important. I just don't want to be an orange Cheeto.
There's a lot to unpack there. I wanted to give you a chance to say something. You raise your hand back here.
Hey? Oh,
Yeah.
hey.
Yeah.
What's up?
Hi. Also admiring your Burning Man do.
Oh, thanks. So I've never been a Burning Man ever in my life, so I want to ask, what's your favorite part?
A Burning Man?
Yeah, like, have you gone before?
Me? Yeah. I've been 13, 14 times.
Oh, okay. I've never been, so.
What's my
what's your favorite part of it?
That's such a hard question. I mean, that's such a hard question. I mean, if I had to answer it, I would probably say the thing that I've been saying about how it's like this phenomenal experience of what is possible. You know, that like you cannot possibly grok unless you're there. And it's hugely inspiring. And then I maybe would say like the depth of human connection. Maybe my second favorite part of Burning Man is there's no internet connection. I like to say it's like going into the past and into the future at the same time. What about you, Kevin?
Yeah, I would say the generosity and just humans showing up in a way. I mean, the art is, aesthetic arrest comes to mind. It's powerful, and people really at their best. And it definitely stretches. Enables the stretch of the imagination, which is so powerful.
Yeah. I sent you this morning. Wow, can everybody mute? And then we'll figure out where the problem is. Did that fix it? No. I sent you the values this morning.
Let me try that.
I sent you this morning, Kevin, the updated version of the values. And I was really wanting generosity to be one of them because I felt like it got at this paradigm shift from me to we, that's so key.
Yeah.
And I think I'm just naturally a very generous person. And I think that is like, the community is showing up in that way because I'm showing up in that way. Like I talked to somebody the other day and she was talking about how she has this crazy network and people always want introductions. And she's like, if you want me to do introductions, like pay your 5,000 membership fee to be in my community and then I'll make introductions for you. And I'm just like, what? Like, I would never do that. I would never do that. It makes me so happy to meet the new person and then be like, here's the half dozen awesome people that you have to meet that's going to help you with what you want to do in the world, So
yeah.
I think I feel like it maybe needs to be front and center. What did I land on? I landed on inclusivity and tried to like pack generosity in. Maybe we need more than 3 values. I need to think on it some more. All right. I should
go through it this morning.
Yeah, I want like lots of fingerprints on them before they go live. I feel like they should have gone live a couple weeks ago before we got as big as we did. But so okay, it's 3:00. I'm going to spend a bit of time with my children before we have a Protect the Vote mega event on Clubhouse at 5:30.
Right.
We have like a half dozen different clubs coming together to talk about what we can do to prevent election interference. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to talk. It's like we're not even getting out the vote; we're protecting it this year. So I'm going to take a little bit of a break. And before I'm back on in a couple hours, but I just wanted to really thank Kevin for coming and spending some of his Sunday with me in the multiverse. Thank all of you for your interest in this topic and your attention, which is your most precious resource. And of course, we're always happy to have you in the conversation. I think you guys know where to find us, and I hope to see you somewhere soon.
Yay,
All right.
Thank you, Jenny.
Now I have to figure out how to. All right. Bye, team.
What to do now?
I know. I did the whole sign up thing. That's why I was so late. Close, sign out. Did I read close?
Here at 6.
All right, everyone, the doors are open. Welcome, everyone. Welcome. The event is going to begin shortly. Please enjoy the space. We've got something interesting to show you for the conversation today. Hey, Othello.
Is it a HoloLens conversation?
Nah, not exactly. No, we're doing a Zoom projection onto the walls inside and outside of the pyramid. So we're just getting a couple of the details sorted out. We'll begin shortly.
Okay.
Welcome, welcome, everyone. You're not late. We're going to be beginning shortly. Come on in inside or outside of the pyramid. take a little bit of time to introduce yourself to a fellow alt spacer, potential burner, thoughtful person, a sense maker.
Yeah, I got through the first 10 minutes of the war on sense making. I'm gonna try to watch that whole thing. There's just a lot of content. Like, there's like 3 parts. Each is like an hour and a half. That's kind of the point, isn't it?
What's that?
That there's too much data for any one person to process, so the sense of the data has to be delivered. But the first 10 minutes
Great.
was like.
What? Am I broadcasting? A little update of what's up. So this is like real life. We're gonna go over to this corner over here, and we're gonna. All right. Drew, I had a team meeting. We decided we hadn't really tested you. You're just so strong and so good and so agile and flexible. This has been too easy for you. So we have a nice curveball for you here. You ready? All right, great. So we got this new feature working. I don't even know if you've seen it. We're going to project it onto the outside of the pyramid. Pretty cool, right? Yeah, that's why we're in night mode. We weren't exactly going to do this all Zoom. We were going to do a portion of it, but now we're going to do it all Zoom. A thing to note is obviously there are people here in the avatar space. From what we can tell, unless Alex has been able to fix it, is the volume is better inside and the visuals are better outside. So I think if you're wearing headphones with your headset, you're probably fine inside. If you're not wearing headphones with your headset, you might want to go inside to hear better. I'll say all of this, but I just wanted to give you this context. And so I'll do the intro, and then I'm actually going to jump on Zoom and interview these 2 incredible gentlemen. I'm going to be in text connection with you because we do want to do Q&A with the avatars. We still want to create that participation. And so you'll be able to question, and then, you'll, I guess, text it to me. Cool, and then, Yeah. But I can't, how would I mute the whole volume for the rest of it?
I heard him say something like.
Right, I can't have any feedback.
I kind of did, but I have no idea what's happening.
Drew, you're a genius. Okay, so I'll turn the volume rocker all the way down, and then how do I keep it? Yeah. Oh, I might be able to do that actually. Okay. All right. At worst. Okay, great. And how are we doing? People are coming in? Okay, cool. I'm gonna get on the mic and just welcome people. I'm gonna tell them to chat with each other because I thought, honestly, that last session seemed like the room was just ready. Like it was good. Thank you so much, Drew. Hey all, welcome to PlayAlchemist. We'll be beginning in a few minutes. I highly encourage you to make friends with those around you. I have found myself personally, as well as just during this week, people are really making really great connections at the speaker series before and after by just simply chatting to those around you. If you're here, you have something in common, you have an interest. So enjoy this moment. You might find yourself in a synchronistic conversation. So let's go with that, and I'll be right back to get us started. Thank you for being here.
It looks like the temple, but I don't think it is.
Massive feedback in here.
And it could also just be how they set up center camp. It doesn't look like center camp normally would, but. I meant the unraveling of the
headphones on.
Speaker series. It's the first event. Oh, it's a conversation with Daniel Wade Davis and Daniel Hockenberg.
Brian, we good to go?
Try and come in there, maybe.
Okay. All right, I'm going to intro. Tell her. All right, we are ready to go. So let's take a moment and first just honor this beautiful build team that came together to build this. The pyramid is my favorite place, obviously, on the playa, and to have it here in its exquisite glory here is just so special. Can we give them some emoji love? Let's honor these builders. It really came together. They brought the vision to life in VR. It's quite incredible. Thank you. And welcome to PlayAlchemist. It means so much to us that you are here with your time and attention. You could be in any of the 9 multiverses. You could be somewhere in IRL, the other multiverse, and you've chosen to be here, and that means so much to us. Thank you so much. We're honored, and we're very excited to share a transformative talk with you. PlayAlchemist was founded on the vision of bringing alchemy to the playa. Alchemy being the transformation of one's personal self from lead to gold. And I'm so excited to have 2 visionaries, alchemists, in conversation with us today to really help us change ourselves from lead to gold. So we're gonna do something we haven't tried before, because this is Burning Man, and when else are you gonna try something amazing? We're going to be projected in video onto the pyramid. This is our first time doing it. Can we give some love for just the audacity it takes to just try something like this? Just want to thank the whole team that's making this all possible and come together. So we're going to project it on, I believe, both sides of the pyramid. You're going to see Wade. You're going to see me. We're going to have a conversation. We're going to talk about his article. He wrote an article that has had 300 million views in the last 3 weeks. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about him. And then we're going to bring Daniel Schmachtenberger up. Him and I will talk for a little bit. And then we'll bring both of them together and we will see what emerges. We're really, really excited here at PlayAlchemist. This is really our grand finale. So thank you for being here. And let's cross our fingers because we're running so many experiments at one time. I'm so excited. See you up there.
Hey everyone, thanks for hanging in here for a little bit. Looks like you know, when you're riding on the edge of technology, sometimes it's a really sharp edge. So please hang out for a little bit. There seems to be the new thing that we're trying seems like it might have snagged some other stuff. I'm not able to unmute at this moment. So I'm going to wait for the producers to tell me if they'd like me to conduct a space reset, which will definitely release everyone's mute. So please hang on, hang out, and we'll be with you in just a little bit.
It's such a pleasure to have you. It's so great to see your face. It's funny, you know, I'm organizing new things and all on calls. It's so great to see your face.
I'm sorry. Please hold. I will let you know when we're in the group. We are live.
Awesome. Thank you. Hey, everyone. I don't know if I've ever been projected on a pyramid before. Thank you for joining us in this radical experiment. I'm honored here to be with Wade Davis. Wade, I've heard about your work for so long, and we actually wanted to get you to speak last year on the playa. And this moment feels like the right time. It has come together, and we're honored that you're here. Thank you, genuinely, from the bottom of my heart.
Well, thank you for making it happen.
My pleasure. There's a whole team, and it's beautiful when people come together and make something happen. I think that's really the essence of Burning Man. It's just people come together and create. And so thank you for being part of this creation. This really is the finale of our whole week. And we're honored to have you. So thank you. I'd love to start with just where you were born.
Oh, I was born in British Columbia. I'm Canadian by birth. I'm also Irish, and I became a naturalized American. I'm also recently became a Colombian citizen as well.
Oh wow! And so that would mean that you lived in the States for a bit.
Oh yeah, I mean, I lived in the States for years and years and years. I went to the university in the States. I really found my career in the States. I mean, this is why this piece I wrote in Rolling Stone, it's often been described as a perspective of a Canadian speaking about the United States, but it's actually really the perspective of someone who really loves the United States and really just wants it once again to be the country of Walt Whitman, Abraham Lincoln, and the Grateful Dead.
Mm. And yeah, let's dig into that. What do you love about the U.S. so much? What is that spirit that
Well, you know, I think everybody. I mean, like all things, the good is the reflection of the bad in a way. You know, I mean, there is, without doubt, there's this kind of entrepreneurial zeal in the United States, which is so charismatic. You know, I first went to college because I used to fight forest fires in British Columbia when I was 15, and all our camps were overrun by U.S. draft dodgers. Because it was the only work they could get. And we were these sort of obsequious, obedient Canadian lads, and these Americans would tell our bosses to piss off, and it was irresistibly charismatic. And one of them had the Life magazine with the Harvard student strike of 1969 on the cover. And as a kid of just 15, in a kind of raw, atavistic way, I thought, well, that's got to be the college you go to become cool like these Americans. And so I applied to Harvard, not really knowing where it was. And I got in, and I flew down to Boston. My family didn't have the means to come with me. And I landed at Logan Airport at the age of, I guess I was 17. And I realized I didn't even really know where Harvard was. And I saw this African-American guy with a Harvard t-shirt. I thought, he's got to know, but he didn't know either. And I dragged my trunk through the subway because my family didn't take taxis. And I ended up coming up in Harvard Square in 1970, 71 in this kind of caravanserai of madness with Hare Krishna and STS and naked women. And I mean, I thought I was in heaven. I realized that my mom and dad had made a mistake, and they sent me down to the States 5 days before the dorms were open. And I had no money, and I was my big steamer trunk, and I dragged that trunk through the streets of Cambridge until I found a church. And I knocked on the door, and this wonderfully benevolent pastor opened up the door, and he put me up for a week. And that's when I fell in love with the United States. That kindness, you know, that kindness to strangers, which seems to be somewhat wanting at the moment. And you know, that wonderful American spirit, sort of do what needs to be done and then ask whether it was possible or permissible. A kind of spirit that says that, you know, pessimism is an indulgence, despair is an insult to the imagination, orthodoxy is the enemy of invention. You know, people like Jim Whittaker, the first American to climb Everest, who famously said, if you're not living on the edge when you're young, you're taking up too much space. And certainly I could never have forged the career that I did in Canada. It just would never have happened. So, you know, when I wrote this piece for Rolling Stone, you know, I think of it as a love letter in a way to a country where, you know, if you have a family member, Satya, who's in trouble, the first stage of a family intervention is to hold a mirror to the face of the individual to show how far they've fallen, and that's the first step on the path of rehabilitation. And the entire thrust of this article is really that COVID has kind of reduced to tatters the illusion of American exceptionalism. You know, Americans woke up to find themselves literally members of a failed state, ruled by a dysfunctional government, headed by an individual recommending the use of bathroom disinfectants for the treatment of a disease that intellectually he did not have the capacity to understand.
Sure. I want to pause. You said something so incredible. I just want to almost highlight it. It sounds like you love the U.S. so much like a family member, and you know that the most powerful thing you can do to help it in its process is to hold up a mirror.
Yeah.
And that's really the perspective that this article is coming from.
Yeah, I mean, what the article describes is something that will cause Americans who love their country to feel sadness, because it's not a pretty picture. You know, it's interesting. Epidemics and pandemics have a way of shifting or moving the wheel of history. The Black Death, for example, wiped out half the population of Europe, and it brought to the end a medieval system of governance that had lasted 1,000 years. By contrast, the Spanish flu of 1918, 1919, which killed millions of people, including my own grandfather, who walked out of his home in the morning and was dead by afternoon. It didn't have the same impact socially, psychologically, in a sense, because it happened in a moment when the entire world was numb by death because of the Great War. By the same token, during the year of Woodstock, the summer of Woodstock, when 500,000 kids took drugs and swam around in the mud of a field in New York State, that summer 100,000 people died of Hong Kong flu. And in Berlin, they were using subway stations to store the cadavers because the morgues were overrun. But again, that didn't have the same impact. We didn't have digital technology, communications as we do today, and most people had never been in an airplane in the 1960s, so the disease was not spreading with the same intensity. But in the case of COVID, it came along right at a time to reveal what had become of America. And as 2,000 Americans were dying every day, an American dying every minute, every hour, we suddenly looked up and saw a nation, in a sense, in tatters. You know, the Irish Times put it perhaps most poignantly when they said in an article that over the years, America's evoked many emotions from other people in the world, from good or bad, or for loving or hating or whatever. But there's one emotion that America has never invoked until now, and that was pity. And as American frontline healthcare workers literally awaited emergency supplies of fundamental needs and basic stuff like swabs and bandages, etc., from China, the hinge of history opened to the Asian century. And, you know, empires never anticipate their demise, but kingdoms are born to die. And if you think of European history, the 15th century belonged to the Portuguese, the 16th to the Spanish, the 17th to the Dutch, the 18th to the French, the 19th to the British. The British Empire actually reached its greatest geographical extent, Satya, in 1935. You know, Brits all over the world were kind of swilling their gin and tonics, but we now, of course, know that the empire was bankrupt and bled white by the Great War, and the torch had passed to America. And so if we kind of look at the trajectory of America in the 20th century, you know, it's hard for people to remember that on the eve of World War II, the United States was a demilitarized country. Both Portugal and Bulgaria had bigger armies than the United States. And then within 3 years, we had 18 million men and women serving in uniform. The United States industrial might saved literally civilization, along with Russian blood. The Ford Motor Company produced more industrial output than the nation of Italy. One plant in Detroit, the Chrysler's Detroit Arsenal, produced more tanks than the entire German Third Reich. We built B-24s, each one of which had 1,500,000 parts. We spat them out by the hour. We built Liberty ships by the hour. The record for building a Liberty ship was 4 days, 29 hours, and 17 minutes. For every 5 pounds of equipment the Japanese Empire, the Sun, got to a frontline troop per capita, America got 2 tons across 13,000 kilometers of water. and literally saved civilization. And when I say that, I'm not speaking in hyperbole. The Nazis had an overt plan to deport every able-bodied man from the United Kingdom, 15 to 45, to slave labor in Europe. This was civilization on the precipice. And then in the wake of the victory, with Europe in ashes and Japan prostrate, the United States, with but 4% of the world's population, controlled 50% of the world's economy, made 90% of the world's automobiles. And that extraordinary concentration of affluence allowed for a truce between capital and labor that gave us the weekend, that gave us the prosperous working class, a time when a man with limited education could have a good job, could buy a home, buy a car, put his kids through good local public schools. And that was the kind of the dream of America. It's a dream in which all boats rose with the tide. People on the far right get nostalgic for the 1950s. It certainly wasn't a great period of time if you were a person of color, a woman, if you were gay. But in economic terms, the country, in fact, resembled Denmark more than it does the America of today. Marginal tax rates in the 1950s were 90%. Now, that doesn't mean that wealthy people all paid 90%.
Sure.
The symbol was there that everybody has to pay. The average CEO, my father-in-law was CEO of Bell and Howell Company in the 1950s. They made all the Hollywood cameras. His income was just 20 times that of an average salaried staff member of his team. Today, that discrepancy would be more like, 400 times. And one of the things that has torn the country apart is economic injustice. The fact that globalization has been celebrated with iconic intensity for 2 generations, when every working man and woman knows that globalization is nothing more or less than capital on the prowl in search of cheap labor. And when we now live in a world where the discrepancies are such that the top 1% controls more than the bottom half of the population, where 1% of the population has $30 trillion in assets, the bottom half of the American public have more debts than assets. The 3 richest individuals in America have more wealth than the entire 160 million of the poorest people in the country. And
sure, I want to jump in. I want to, your articles really resonate. It has, I think, 300 million views last I checked. That's unheard of, right?
Yeah, the story sort of become a story. I mean, it's trended #1 on the Rolling Stone website for a month.
Sure.
I think Jan told me 4 to 5 million people have seen on the Rolling Stone. As I said, as of a week ago, 350 million people, social media impressions worldwide. And I think it's speaking of some kind of yearning because,
Right. I think what the numbers represent is that it's resonating with people, right? More than it being #1, it's like, wow, like this is sparking something in them. At that level, it's sparking a strong emotion. What do you think that emotion is that people are connecting to?
No, there's two major responses. Obviously, those who are sympathetic or open to the ideas expressed, who love their country but have seen it unraveling before their eyes and recognize it as such, generally express incredible sadness and hope that the country can correct its course. Coming in from the other side, if you will, are incredibly vitriolic, vicious, generally misogynist critiques which have nothing to do with the content of the article. It's almost like I've been called everything from menstrual discharge to, I mean, the terms that come in. And it's curious because the people who have that response seem to be singularly incapable of dealing with the issues and the data presented in the article or the arguments of that article. It's sort of their only gut response is hatred and really quite vicious language directed toward the messenger, because they can't deal with the message. But again, this article is not in any way gloating. It's not celebrating the demise of America. It's a lament. But the bottom line is that, a country that once spat out fighter planes by the hour couldn't manage to get it together to get cotton swabs and had to depend on overseas supplies. It's a country that defeated polio and smallpox, found itself led by a president advertising the use of bathroom disinfectants. A country that celebrated the free flow of information is in fact ranks 45th in terms of press freedom. A country that celebrates freedom as an individual's right to own a personal arsenal of weaponry, even a right that trumps the well-being of children. 346 kids being killed in schools over the last decade.
Let's talk about the individual for a moment. I love that you're talking about that. And what's curious, right, is that, or maybe here's a question. What can somebody do to look around at their life and feel this discrepancy that has motivated you to write this article? Your love of America.
Again, it's like anything else. You can't solve a problem until you understand its dimensions. And one of the things you asked me earlier at the very head of our conversation, what do I love about America? Of course, what I love about America is the way that the country celebrates the individual. This gives us huge mobility, huge flexibility, huge personal freedom, but it also comes at the cost of social solidarity. In a sense, the United States has lost not just a sense of community, but the very idea of society itself. It's almost as if no one owes anything to anyone and no one is deserving of anything. And if you look at, what we've become, I mean, the American people consume 2/3 of the world's antipsychotic drugs. Opioid addiction is a cause of mortality, the highest cause of mortality for people below the age of 50. We celebrate slogans like 24/7, implying total dedication to the workplace at the expense of family. And then we wonder why the average American youth fully the glass screen, be it a laptop or a video game, contributing to an obesity epidemic that is described by the Joint Chiefs of Staff as a national security crisis. I mean, go to any sporting, look for example, at a photograph of any sporting event in the 1940s, and you'll be hard pressed to find anyone who is overweight. Now look at a sporting event and you're hard pressed to find anyone who is not, if not clinically obese, certainly overweight. And it's almost like the country no longer has a sense of benign purpose. When, for example, people flock to the beaches or mock the use of a mask or go to conventions, they're not displaying strength or freedom. They're actually displaying the weakness of a people who lack the stoicism to endure the pandemic or the fortitude to defeat it. Donald Trump is the target of much ire from the left, but he's not the cause of this decline. He's a symptom of the descent. And the perfect sort of sign of the decadence is the fact that in 2016, 62 million Americans voted their grievance. They voted their indignation. They voted for their own interest in terms of that set of emotions of anger and vitriol and so on. And in doing so, they elected someone who they knew bloody well had no credentials for the job, save his willingness to validate their hatreds and target their enemies, real and imagined. That is a sign of decadence. And that's what Oscar Wilde, in a sense, meant when he quipped that America was the only country to go from barbarism to decadence without passing through civilization. And let me try to explain. COVID's unveiled this. I mean, think about this. Canada is no perfect place, that's for sure. Our medical system is no perfect system, but it does focus on the collective, not the individual, and certainly not the private investor who views every hospital bed as if it's a rental property. On July 30th of this summer, even as the Americans announced 59,629 new cases of COVID in all of British Columbia. Again, we have a major concentration in the metropolitan area of Vancouver. We're an Asian city. We have dozens of flights coming in from China and elsewhere in East Asia every day. We're 2 hours up the road from Seattle, where the pandemic landed in the United States. Logically, we should have been hammered by this. But on the very day that the Americans were announcing 60,000 new cases of COVID, in all of our hospitals in British Columbia, a province with a population roughly comparable to that of Massachusetts, we had only 5 cases of COVID. So what is going on here that wasn't going on in the United States? What is going on in New Zealand? What is going on in Australia? What is going on in Denmark? You know, it's often said in America that, you know, social democracies are communism light, or it'll never work in America. And that may be true, but if so, it's a stunning indictment. Social democracies have nothing to do with socialism. They're simply dynamic capitalist economies which focus on the well-being of every tier of society. You know, I always try to explain the difference to my American friends and family members by using an allegory of getting your groceries at Safeway. When you get your groceries at a Safeway anywhere in the United States pretty well, there's a kind of an economic, social, racial, class, educational chasm between you and the checkout person that's very difficult to bridge. And when you get your groceries in Canada, or Denmark for that matter, you don't feel that chasm. It doesn't mean that you necessarily interact as peers. It doesn't mean that you may not have more education or less education, more wealth, less wealth than the checkout person, but you do interact as if members of a wider community. And why is that? It's very simple. They know that they're getting a living wage because of the unions. And they know that probably their kids go to the same neighborhood public school, which critically in British Columbia, for example, are not funded by property taxes, which benefit the children of the affluent and the affluent neighborhoods, but funded by state grants that give every kid per capita the same chance for educational advancement. And third, and most important, they know that if their kids get sick, they will get not only exactly the same medical care as your children, but those of the Prime Minister. And those three strands woven together become the social fabric of democracy in a place like Denmark, Canada, or New Zealand. You know, healthcare in the States seems to be always an issue of insurance, of political antagonisms, of even medical care, but actually healthcare is not about medicine. Healthcare is about social solidarity. It's about fairness. It's about sending a message that everybody counts. And that is what is missing today in America. People do not feel that they count. And that is the origin of the anger that inspires and fuels the supporters of President Trump. I'll give you one final example that I think really is quite beautiful. Sachi, when my mother was 85, she got a headache at 11 o'clock in the morning. By 1 o'clock, she was in neurosurgery, being operated on by the greatest neurosurgeon in Canada. He saved her life. And by the time my sister and I got to the intensive care unit, my mother, of course, was in recovery, but there was another family in that same unit with a young girl who had suffered the same kind of aneurysm and was a farm girl from Manitoba, surrounded by a dozen of her family members. Now, it was very moving because she had gotten exactly the care my mother had gotten, and both my mother and that girl were saved by that incredible neurosurgeon. Now, if that had happened in the States, my sister and I, she's a prominent lawyer, I've done well, we could have paid whatever bill there was. That farm family from Manitoba in the States could well have faced a choice between the well-being of their child and the economic well-being of their family. We don't think in Canada that that's a choice that anyone should have to make in a civilized nation. Now, the fanciest hotel in Victoria, where this hospital was, one of the Fairmont hotels now, it's a legendary Empress Hotel, one of the old CP Railroad hotels, had a rule that any family member of any Canadian in an ICU unit at any hospital in Victoria got a free room for the night. So after we were chased out of the ICU by the nurses, we all piled into our vehicles and we poured down to the hotel where we all went to have a drink together. Now the family from Manitoba were all Christian and they didn't drink at all. So I bought apple juice and orange juice all around, and my sister and I had a beer perhaps, and we toasted, but we didn't toast the survival of our loved ones, although it was very much in our hearts. And we didn't toast each other. And we didn't even toast the hotel for being so generous and kind to us. We toasted our country for having a healthcare system that brought us together from two different sides of the economic spectrum in Canada, but united in grief for our loved ones, but also united in hope and the realization that our country did not let either one of us down in a moment of incredible peril. That is what universal healthcare is all about. It's about people feeling that it's right, that they have a part of the overall story of America, that their children won't get sick and have no services. You know, it's things like that that create social solidarity. And until America finds a way to come together, to bridge this chasm that is so wide and so deep, it's hard to imagine how the nation will have a chance to move forward, certainly into another century of dominance. You know, think of it this way. You know, if we went into World War II a demilitarized society, we never stood down after the war. You know, we have American soldiers in 150 countries today. China hasn't gone to war once since the 1970s. The United States hasn't once been at peace. We've spent $6 trillion on military adventures since 2000. In those same years, China has been building its country, pouring more cement every 3 years than America did in the entire 20th century. So, all of these are the signs of a country in retreat. And the biggest question for America, I think, emotionally, psychologically, how will a country that has been raised on the myth of its exceptionalism deal with a new reality? How is it that a country that, once welcomed the huddled masses of the world, how is it that more people now favor the building of a wall along the southern border to keep desperate mothers and their children out, mothers and children who are desperately there because of our policies in the 1980s and 90s in wars in Central America that dislocated the entire civil society, and our consumption of cocaine today, which has facilitated the illegal trade, which now is sweeping like a firestorm through the Central American nations, through Mexico and to our borders. I even go as far, Satya, as maintaining that those in favor of building a wall along the American-Mexican border are not only misguided, they're acting, it's an act of treason. Because what, after all, is a definition of treason? It's when you betray the essence of your country, when you betray the better angels of your nature. It's when you deny the ideals for which your ancestors fought and died in countless wars. That is, to my mind, what treason is. Treason isn't when you refuse to go along with flag-wrapped patriotism at a convention. Freedom is not flaunting the well-being of your fellow citizens by refusing to follow basic medical advice that has nothing to do with politics. So, again, I stress it, nothing I wrote in that article is in any way an attempt to gloat. There's nothing to celebrate, believe me. If and when the torch of history, the hinge of history, if you will, opens to an Asian century with China dominant, China with its treatment of ethnic groups in the concentration camps of the Northwest, the treatment of democracy in the streets of Hong Kong, with its social capital measures of the individual, measuring deviance from orthodoxy and the state, when it and its treatment of press freedoms and so on. We will be longing for the best years of the American century, and it's my fervent hope, in a sense, that the prognosis that is distilled in this Rolling Stone article, The Unraveling of America, nobody would more prefer to be shown to be totally wrong than me.
That's beautiful. I love that phrase, fervent hope. And I love the humility in you to say, I hope I'm wrong about this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. It gets back to this idea that, you've got to look, you can't deny what the society has become, as I say, flag-wrapped patriotism is no match for compassion. You have a situation where the truth has become whatever people want it to be. If the first American president famously couldn't tell a lie, the current one literally cannot recognize the truth. If Abraham Lincoln asked for charity for all and malice toward none, this troll of a president, in my opinion, has inverted that by seeking malice for all and charity for none. But again, Trump, odious as I think he is not the cause of this. He is a symptom of the descent. And everybody who has facilitated the division between people. One of the things that is very Canadian, I suppose, is that you grew up in a land like this where for most of our history there were more lakes than people, where the weight of the winter hovers in the north. We are a civil society. We practice consilience. We do get along with each other. The idea of a Canadian politician wrapping themselves in the flag makes no sense. We didn't even have one until 1965, and then the country came to a standstill as we argued as to one or three maple leafs. The most perfect expression of our muted patriotism is a line of Francophone verse from the great poet Gilles Vigneault, who said, "Mon pays n'est pas un pays, c'est l'hiver." My country is not a country, it's the winter. And yet at the same time, you know, we measure wealth not by the currency accumulated by the lucky few, but by the strength of social relations and the bonds of reciprocity that bind all of us in common purpose. That is, to my mind, the definition of a civilized nation.
So, where do we go from here?
Well, you know, one thing that, you know, you mentioned, you know, I've recently written a book, Magdalena, River of Dreams, which is kind of a love letter toward Colombia. And I recently was made an honorary Colombian citizen by President Juan Manuel Santos, a Nobel laureate. And Colombia has always been a place very close to my heart. When I was 14, my mother, kind of a humble but determined Canadian woman, told me that Spanish was the language of the future. And she worked all year as a secretary to earn enough money to allow me to join a small group of schoolboys that a teacher was taking to Colombia in the summer of 1968. And it was an extraordinary exposure to me. Many of the other older Canadian lads suffered from what the Colombians called mamitis, or homesickness. And I, by contrast, felt like I had finally found home. And but Colombia, of course, is another nation that's been torn asunder. A 50-year war, a three-way war, which has led to 220,000 dead, 7 million internally displaced. But the fuel of that war has always been cocaine. And, you know, I mean, the war wouldn't have lasted a day. The paramilitaries wouldn't have come into being. The FARC would have fizzled out years ago if it hadn't been for cocaine. At the height of the cartel, the Medellin cartel was budgeting $1,000 a week just to buy elastic bands to wrap the $70 million a day they were making. And the last year before the Havana agreement that brought peace, the FARC were down to 6,000 cadre, mostly teenagers in search of 3 meals a day. And yet the FARC were making $600 million from cocaine. And if you give me, you know, the Burning Man Boy Scouts and $600 million, I can wreak havoc in the state of Nevada. And so one of the messages of the book is that, in a sense, we all owe something to Colombia. You know, even as Colombia, the world's falling apart, and Colombia's falling together. But we should remember that, you know, how would we feel in the States, for example, if Canada had patterns of drug consumption and in boards and barrooms across the country, and also drug laws that didn't really do much to curb the illicit trade but made possible that trade, such that 85 million Americans were forced to flee from their homes. Well, that per capita is what happened to Colombians. And yet through all those years, Colombia maintained civil society and democracy, greened its cities, sought restitution with First Nations, created millions of acres of national parks, and now is poised for this kind of amazing intellectual, artistic, and economic renaissance. And people are suddenly realizing that this is not a country of violence and drugs. This is a place of colores y cariño, where, you know, the richest biodiversity on earth. There is no place in Colombia more than a day removed from every known ecosystem to be found on the planet Earth, and so on, and more species of birds than any other, and of course culture and music and everything. And you know, magical realism celebrated as Gabriel Garcia Marquez's contribution to Latin American literature. He was a journalist. He was a journalist, a practicing journalist all his life. He just wrote about what he saw. He just happened to live in a place where heaven and earth come together on a regular basis to reveal glimpses of the divine. And there is a lesson, you know, the book is Magdalena, which is the Mississippi of of Colombia. And in the same way that the Mississippi is a corridor of commerce and also a fountain of culture, the Magdalena is a source of music and poetry, prayer and literature. And the schism between the Colombian people, fueled by the cocaine trade, became extraordinarily violent. There is no one who hasn't suffered. And what has brought the country together, to the extent that it is tentatively walking toward peace, is just pure collective exhaustion. Generally, when nations are torn asunder by polarization, whether it's Ireland or whether it's South Africa or whether it's Colombia or now the United States, the one hope is there comes a point when people are just collectively had enough. You know, in Colombia, 2 schoolboys just got on Facebook and said, "No más FARC, no more FARC." And 3 weeks later, 2 million people were in the streets of Bogota with that slogan. You know, and the States has been torn apart before. You know, we forget how truly horrible the McCarthy years were, where this alcoholic troll of a man from Wisconsin was the most powerful man in Washington. People were terrified of his ire, of his rhetoric, of his accusations. Careers were ruined from the United Nations to Hollywood by this extraordinary, awful man. And then suddenly, his power, which had sort of ebbed for a number of years, and there was that one fantastic moment where a senator, largely unknown today, simply spoke those powerful words, "Sir, have you no shame? You know, at last you have no shame." And the artifice of McCarthyism cracked like porcelain, like a glass, and the man was dead from alcoholism, you know, within months. So, you know, the nightmare that America is facing will not be solved by the election in November. Even if Biden wins handily, there will still be a deeply disaffected cohort, which is a core Trump supporters. And you know Donald Trump will do everything he can to exasperate that division for his own self-interest and his own vanity. So it'll take more than the election of a Democrat, just as it will to heal America, just as it will take more than the re-election of Trump to destroy America, finally. But what will bring America together is when the people of America, the vast majority of Americans, simply say, enough, we're better than this. This is not who we are. You know, we are the country of Abraham Lincoln. We are the country of the Grateful Dead. We are the country of Walt Whitman. And let's be that country again. And that's when things will change. After all, Burning Man did not start in Brussels. You know, Burning Man didn't start in Vancouver. Burning Man didn't start in Paris or in Delhi or in Beijing. It started on a beach in California with the best dreams of the American century still ahead. And so, you know, any country that can pull off something like Burning Man sure has another chance on life.
I appreciate that. Wade, I love that your work is so focused on others to the extent of focusing on nations. I'm curious what drives you to have such a, you know, for that to be your interest, for that to be something you want to hold a mirror to. I'm just really curious about, you know, where that comes from.
Well, Satya, you know, I'm a storyteller. I'm an old Irish storyteller. It's in my blood, I think, you know. You know, Hemingway said that, he said a bunch of things. He said, you know, anyone who thinks that writing is easy is either a bad writer or a liar. And you know, writing is hard. That's what makes it great. And I at least feel that to be motivated to complete a book, and I've written 23 books, you know, you have to have some sense of passion, some sense of mission, some sense of correcting, you know, exposing, or maybe even hopefully doing something about injustice in wherever it flares up, or at least drawing people's attention to the to the passions of the past, or something emotive, you know, that's the heart, you know. And he also said that the most important credential for a writer is to have something to say that the world needs to hear. And you know, I've always been driven since that first exposure in that church in Cambridge at the age of 17, and even before then, to social justice. You know, I saw what the treatment of women did to my mother, destroyed her life. She would have been running Bell and Howell Company if she'd been alive a generation later. You know, so I mean, I was a feminist before the concept was there. I grew up in that atmosphere. I grew up, you know, my closest friend, Tim Plowman, died of AIDS. You know, I could go on and on, you know. But the other thing is that, you know, my father wasn't a religious man, but he was a deeply ethical man. And he did believe in good and evil. And, you know, he said, you know, there's good and evil in the world. Take your side and get on with it. And that's pretty good advice. And one of the things that is, you know, in the Christian tradition, we have this sort of illusion that, you know, we have the Christ child and we have the fallen archangel, and we have this illusion that good's going to triumph sometime over evil, that if we just push hard enough, you know, that evil will go away. Well, that's a very Western idea. In the East, for example, when Krishna was famously asked by a disciple what he, you know, why the obvious question, the great heresy of the medieval ages, you know, if God's all powerful, why does he allow evil to exist in the universe? Well, if you ask that as in France in the year 1100, you'd be burned at the stake. But when you could ask that in India, and when Lord Krishna was asked that very question by a disciple, you know, if God's all powerful, why does he allow evil in the universe? Lord Krishna said, to thicken the plot. In other words, this is a whole dharma. You know, the whole idea of the Four Noble Truths. You know, in Buddhism, you know, all life is suffering. It doesn't mean that all life is negation. It means that shit happens, evil happens. The cause of suffering is ignorance. By that, the Buddha didn't mean stupidity. He meant the tendency of people to cling to the cruel illusion of their own centrality in the stream of divine existence. The third of the Noble Truths was a revelation that ignorance could be overcome. And then, of course, the fourth was the delineation of a contemplative practice that, if followed, not only had a possibility of a transformation of the human heart, but had 2,500 empirical years saying that transformation would happen. And, you know, one of the reasons that at the age of 66, I can stay as passionate, as engaged, as hopeful, indeed, as I am, is that I never expect to win. You know, bitterness comes to those who expect something, expect to win an environmental battle every time, or expect to succeed, or whatever it is. But if you realize that the path of life is not bringing you towards a destination, the path of life is just a path. And the journey you're on is exactly that. And the goal is not a destination, but a state of mind. Then you get the kind of, you know, you're able to just keep going, because you never expect to win. You don't really expect anything at all, and you're pushing the wheel, hopefully, and it sounds a little precious and sanctimonious, but you're hoping that we're all hoping that we're pressing the wheel of justice and decency and kindness but it's not like we're going to get up to that mountaintop. You know, no, you have to keep doing it. And the whole thing in life is that, you know, to be the architect, the biggest challenge in life, the creative challenge, is to be the architect of your own life. And you always see when you meet someone in their later years, the people who are bitter are the ones who look back on a lifetime of choices imposed upon them by peers or society or internal pressures. And people who are happy in older age are always those who can look back and realize that they may have not always made every choice the right one, but they owned all those choices, and they were the architect of your own life. and that is the formula for contentment in old age. When I was a really young boy wandering around Colombia, when I was 19 and 20, sleeping where my hat fell, protected by a cloak of warmth from the Colombian people, I met an old shaman who told me something really amazing. He said, in your early years, you're too young to understand the world around you. And in your later years, you're too old to understand the world coming at you from below or from behind. And in between, he said, there's a narrow sliver of light, a narrow beam of light that illuminates your life. And that is when your destiny is unveiled. So, I always say to young people, always be patient and give your destiny time to find you.
Oh man,
that's powerful. And
I think we're stuck in a time loop.
Your time is precious.
So yeah, hang
I know
on
this
for just a
Sunday
moment while they
evening.
get the Zoom figured out, and then we'll have Daniel
Thank you
Schmachtenberger
for being here.
joining
I
us
wonder
as well
if
here.
that was such a high note. I wonder if
Excellent. Thanks
if you
everyone
also
for
feel
hanging out.
similarly that this might be a good time for us to take a
projection
pause.
onto the
Sure.
inside
Talk to Daniel,
of the
and
structure.
then
Man, this
I'm just so
this
excited
pyramid
to
here
bring
at
you
Play
guys
Alchemist has gotten
together.
so much
It'd be great, Dr. No problem.
Okay.
hardcore use.
Wait, thank
over
you
the
so much.
past week.
We're really
It's
honored
really
to have
incredible.
you here projected. Oh, you should
So please hang out for a
do
sec.
something funny.
Daniel Schmachtenberger is coming soon.
We'll get a funny photo of you projected on a giant pyramid.
Here we go.
Studying, working on for years. This is what, like maybe 5 years ago when we met, 4 or 5 years ago when we met. I knew you were thinking about sense making and rebuilding civilizations, and I'm curious. I've had the pleasure of just kind of being around you for years. What's the best way to tell probably a new audience about your work? I feel like, I'm wondering your favorite way to explain that.
I don't know that I have a favorite way to explain it, but
I'll jump in if I'll give my perspective, but I'd love to hear if you have a shot.
Kind of just a brief narrative from the beginning is I was homeschooled growing up, so I got to kind of make my own curriculum, which was fortunate. And a lot of it had to do with activism. My mom was big into activism, so I got into environmental work and animal rights work and social justice issues young. And my dad was into lots of areas of science and engineering and philosophy, so I was getting to have that braid of topics. And as I was exploring activism, one of the things that I found was how profoundly interconnected the problems were and how the solutions weren't adequately addressing them. And this started showing up all over the place. I got it in terms of looking at why are the ecological issues advancing and not getting better despite the huge amount of effort happening in the nonprofit space and government and for-benefit space. What is fundamentally inadequate about the nature of the solution? I remember being 13, working on helping some project that was in Kenya, protecting elephants from poaching in an area that was already protected, that the poachers could get in. And so I was 13, so I was just in the US, like going door to door, raising money and writing letters. And but the people who were there on the ground were having their life threatened by the poaching groups. And the solution was bigger fences around the preserve so poachers couldn't get in, and legislation in the country for harsher sentencing for poachers. And the solution, after a couple of years of like blood, sweat, and tears, finally worked. But it didn't address the poverty of the people that were poaching and the fact that, they were in parts of the world where 25,000 kids are starving to death a day. It didn't address black markets on animal products. It didn't address mindsets towards animals. It didn't address a macroeconomy that creates poverty at scale and ships it to the third world. It didn't address any of those issues. So the same poaching groups moved and started hunting both the mountain gorilla and the white rhino more than they had been, both of which were more endangered. And I got to see this because I wasn't just looking at one issue. I was working with enough groups that I got to see that those were connected. And so the tremendously hard and well-motivated work solved one problem, but actually moved the underlying problem space to show up in areas that were even more sensitive. And that was really devastating because the only kind of hope that I had to deal with the devastation of the nature of the problems was that something could be done about it. And so fortunately, I was also studying not just all the different areas of science that I could, but system science and Bucky Fuller's work and Capra's work, and kind of how do all the things fit together. And so I started looking at activism from that lens and saying, how can we understand the nature of the problems well enough that we can come up with solutions that solve that problem, but also don't externalize harm elsewhere? And that required starting to get into economics and the nature of why does perverse incentive arise, and what would it take to internalize perverse incentive and externality, and the nature of governance systems and culture, and basically civilization writ large. And so then that led to saying, okay, well, there's a lot of things that we can say are getting better. You can listen to Hans Rosling or Steven Pinker and pick things that are getting better. But you can also look at most environmentalists or people studying existential risk and look at things getting worse, and both are the case. There are some metrics getting better, there are some getting worse. That's a destabilization of the overall space, but the things that are getting worse are leading to catastrophic tipping points that will break the substrate that allows the things that are getting better to matter. So I started forecasting how long do we have on the various things, and started reading Limits of Growth by Club of Rome and all of the different kind of forecasts, as well as studying civilizational collapse theory, Tainter and Baudrillard and things like that. Because it becomes pretty clear when you study history that all of the great empires that lived for hundreds or thousands of years don't still exist.
I'm curious, how old are you when you're diving into this inquiry? It's just so fascinated that you're so interested and have the dedication to dive into this. When does this occur in your life?
I mean, this is kind of the thread of my whole life, just progressively deeper insight into the process. If you spend time talking with kids where you listen and then actually give them space for the questions to emerge, the dedication is there. Like I do nature walks with kids, and they want to ask around about how do trees suck up water, and how does the light thing work, and how do all the animals and everything interact, and very deep questions. They want to know why the sky is blue, which actually requires understanding things about optics and about astronomy and about the sun, about astrophysics, and as well as like the nature of consciousness. What is the subjective experience of blue? And school just doesn't do a great job of actually facilitating that curiosity. And so if we force people to be interested in shit they aren't interested in, and don't facilitate their interest in the things they're actually interested in, we kind of break their interest, and then they want to use some hypernormal stimuli. So I was just fortunate that the things that were interesting to me, I got to pay attention to. And I think anyone that gets to continue to pay attention to the things they're interested in learns, but they also double down on their own interest. So the things I'm describing now were a lot of my kind of teenage focus. And so I started looking at, forecasting and civilizational collapse models, anything from environmental collapse, from overfishing and, peak resource utilization, to pollution issues, to, climate type issues, as well as what are the things that lead to large scale war and infrastructure collapse and those types of things. And that led to recognizing as our technology exponentiates and the power of our choices exponentiate, but our quality of choice making is not getting commensurately better to the power of our choice making, we're having more and more different escalation pathways to catastrophic risk globally, and higher probability of them, where if we try to think about like biotech risks or nanotech risks or AI mediated risk or large scale war or grid collapse, if we tried to solve any of them on their own, they're almost all impossible to solve, and there's too many of them. So I started thinking about what is driving all of them. Why are humans coordinating at scale in a way that uses our technological power in ways that either directly through conflict theory cause problems, war, and exploitation that is known, or through mistake theory cause problems, unintended externalities. And a lot of it is that, right? Like, I don't think the people when they were making Facebook knew that it would destroy the entire information ecology, but it did. So that's the kind of information theoretic issue. So we started thinking about, is there some set of underlying dynamics that give rise to how humans are coordinating that are what gives rise to all these problems, the generator functions of them? And to just start to think about like perverse incentive, as long as military industrial complex is one of the largest blocks of the global economy and war is profitable, and you have the capacity for the supply side to manufacture artificial demand, can you have a for-profit military-industrial complex that the entire global economy depends upon and lasting peace in a supply and demand equation? Well, no. So we have to deal with perverse incentive there. That's one example. We can see it in healthcare, and we can see it in mining, and we can see it everywhere. And so you start looking at, is the nature of the incentive system, the economic system where $50 to $100 trillion a day of human activity moves, but is either directly causing harm or indirectly causing externality, could we shift that in a way where that incentive system, what was in the incentive of an individual or a corporation or a nation was in the aligned with the well-being of the whole better, right? So these were the questions I was asking, and trying to study the Austrian school and straight kind of laissez-faire approaches, or socialist approaches, or Marxist approaches, or like techno-optimist, automate everything approaches. And I got to see that there were strengths and weaknesses of a lot of them, and none of them were actually adequate to the space. So we put together some research groups that were working on understanding the space, the generator functions of catastrophic risk well enough to say, is there a categorical set of solutions to the underlying dynamics of how humanity coordinates effectively that is the kernel of a new civilization model? And that when we study civilizational decay of what made Rome fall, and Egypt and the Aztecs and the Mayans and et cetera, that if we understand the dynamics that give rise to civilizational collapse, can we have something that really addresses all of those dynamics and addresses all of the escalation pathways to the catastrophic risks we can see? So
it sounds like, almost, correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe a simple way to put that is, if you were to redesign civilization from scratch, how would you do it? Is that it's almost the frame of like, well, everything that we've done has these strengths and weaknesses. What would we do if we do it again from scratch? Is that kind of where you're coming from here?
Well, this is a valuable question, and it's an insufficient question. And I spent a lot of time when I was young asking it without recognizing the enactment problem. Okay, so we actually get there in factoring that seems that all the people are conditioned currently who are in power in a way that would resist that, and it seems to be not in the immediate best interest of the game theoretic environment. So yes, it's an important thought experiment. If we were going to redesign civilization from scratch, how do we think the best run planet would run, most enlightened planet would be? Then we have to say, in the current scenario, what is actually a viable path there? And to some degree, you reverse engineer from the idea of a future state. To some degree, you forward engineer. How can we be vectoring in the right direction and increasing our capacity to continue to vector in the right direction?
So what I'm hearing is great thought experiment.
Hey, Google, lights on.
that's not, Eugene, do you mind muting yourself? Although that's a great thought experiment, change doesn't start. We can't just hit a button and then redesign. You're saying, cool, great thought experience to have that vision, to think about what is that beautiful thing, and changes evolution. Changes, it's messy, right? To actually get to that vision, we actually have to start with where we are.
Yeah.
So where are we, and where do you see us actually being able to go from where we are?
So I'll try to bridge this to some of what Wade was talking about. He was talking about the unraveling of the American empire. I think we can look at, and I don't claim to be representing his views accurately here, but just kind of piggyback on some of the thoughts. We can look at the United States system and say, is it undergoing civilizational decay in the way that led to the breakdown of previous civilizations? And what would the signs of that be? What kind of things can we look for? We can also look at the global system that the world has actually run on since World War II that has been US based. And it's very important to look at these together. From the US perspective, we can, one just kind of quick insightful thing is that throughout history, democracies or republics, systems of participatory governance that were at scale, not like small tribal scales, never made it to 300 years, right? They have a fairly short life cycle. All empires died, but some of the dynastic ones made it 1,000 years. And the ones that were more participatory governance systems lasted less long. The US is at around 250 years, depending upon exactly the start date you pick. So this is the time cycle factoring history of the adequate decay of a republic. And to understand why, there's a bunch of reasons why, and I won't get into all of them, but the people who are willing to fight a revolutionary war to make something happen, right? If they lived in the direct experience of tyranny of government and where they were willing to die rather than let themselves be governed in a way that felt tyrannical, then they're also willing to do the extraordinarily hard work of participatory governance, which means show up at the town hall, not just let somebody else make the decisions, read all the papers, be actively informed about what's going on so that you can participate in governance, because you have the direct experience of how terrible not being involved in your own governance is. But as time goes on and several generations pass, and that just becomes a myth that no one has any embodied experience of, and there's like mortgages to pay and stuff on TV and shit to do, I don't even want to go to jury duty, let alone be really actively informed and engaged in participatory governance. So if the people stop checking the state and it's no longer truly a governance of, for, and by the people, then the state stops being able to do what it's supposed to do, which is check the predatory aspects of the market. I'll just make this frame because that's an important frame.
Absolutely, I love it.
One way of thinking about all of the problems in the world is that they're all coordination problems. That it's patterns of human behavior at scale that cause them, and it needs to be different patterns of human behavior at scale to solve them. And so how do we get lots of people to coordinate their behavior when they want different things and they have different understandings of the world and different worldviews in ways that lead to better solutions for the individual groups and the whole overall? It's a hard thing. When the Churchill said about democracy, and the founding fathers here said something similar, that democracy is the single worst form of government ever created, save for all the other forms. What they meant is the idea of governance, that you get a lot of different people to actually participate together, is just a really hard proposition. And it's why, if you look at human history, until like the thing we call civilization only started 10, 13,000 years ago. But we have 200 or 300,000 years of sapient existence of people that were genetically and neurologically similar to us. And those groups never got beyond, give or take, what's called the Dunbar number, 150 people in a tribe. And it's like, why was that such a hard upper bound? Why did, for hundreds of thousands of years, humans never make groups bigger than that? And it's actually like, the simplest way I would think of it is it had to do with limits of coordination. Limits of communication and coordination. If the tribe has to make a decision that's very consequential, to move or not, or to change some deep aspect of how they do things, up to about that size, everyone can participate in a tribal council and all have a say in what the rest of their life is going to be subject to. But as soon as you start getting more people than that, everyone can't actually have a say, because you can't just, you can't have time to listen to 1,000 people, right? It would take a month to make a decision on anything, and no one would even have the work memory to hold it. And so then I have to pick representatives to make choices on my behalf. Now my life is subject to choices that I don't have a say in. No, I'd rather cleave and make my own smaller group and be more self-determined. And so the Dunbar number was a limit of how, and up to that size, I could talk to everyone and get their sense made on things. So I didn't just have this like anonymous, the right or the left over there that I could just have a pejorative straw man version of. I had people that I knew intimately. So that's almost all of evolutionary history. Now, when the tribe would get as big as it could get, then it would cleave and some of the people would move somewhere else. Lots of migration happened till eventually population keeps growing. We've migrated everywhere that we can. Now population keeps growing and tribal warfare becomes pressed, right? Because now we're competing for scarce resource. Now there's a basis to have tribes unify against larger external tribes, and we call that kind of the beginning of civilization, which means it was in a war, game theoretic kind of context. And so now we unify together and try to create government structures for these larger numbers of people because we have to. And so there's binding energy to hold the cleaving energy associated with an enemy hypothesis.
Can I jump in?
Sure.
So when I think of coordination, it feels like it's so related to connection. And if you want to take it further, maybe empathy, right? When people don't have a sense of each other or where they're at or what the pain and problem is, people don't really care. Like, you know, if you know I really care about something, Daniel, and you might be like, oh, you should meet this person, and that could change my life. Right, you might give me 10 minutes, you might give me an hour, you might help, but it feels like that coordination starts with some sort of connection. That came up for me, so I wanted to
it's a
see
nice,
what you feel.
I mean, there definitely needs to be some fealty, and it's a nice idea that it emerges from empathy. It doesn't have to emerge from empathy. It can emerge from a shared enemy, which it often does. And so then there's fealty to each other, not because we necessarily care about each other, but because we care about ourselves and our sub-in group, and we feel that we have to be bound with them against whoever the out-group is. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the Dunbar number was partly a limit on how many relationships I could deeply track. And I'm willing to make certain sacrifices of what I want most for people I really know and love and I've known forever and I see every day and they know me. It's much harder to make sacrifices for anonymous people that I have no idea who they are, that are somewhere else, right? And so as you get beyond that, you have to have a shared religion or patriotism or some kind of group identity that everyone gets to be part of, so that they identify with each other through shared group identity, right? We can see that in the US that is broke down, where there's very little sense of what it means to be a US citizen that everyone's on the same page with, that really creates binding energy. There's much more of a sense of what it means to be on the left or the right that has so much enmity towards each other that the thing as a whole doesn't have something like shared nationalism or patriotism, and that's part of the issue.
Sure. Well, I guess, so fundamentally, do humans just need pain or an enemy to really come together and coordinate in a larger way? at scale?
It's a good question. And I think I'll better be able to answer it if we go back to the train was on about coordination.
Go for it.
So if we look at all of the issues we want to solve as coordination issues, because we say, well, no, climate change is not a coordination issue. It's a straightforward environmental issue. We've got to do certain things with the transportation and the energy sector and whatever. No, it's a coordination issue because you have to have enough people that have a shared worldview around what is true, what is real, what the problem is, that they can come up with adequate solutions, and that a major chunk of humanity isn't fighting against them to keep it from happening because they have a different worldview or different assessment, right? And let's say that your solution involves whatever, some kind of carbon tax or something that countries have to agree to. And agreement without enforcement ends up being a very tricky thing. And how do you do enforcement internationally with superpowers that have nukes? So let's say that the US and Europe were to agree to some kind of taxation policy which decreased their near-term GDP growth, but was good for the environment long-term, and we'd all say, well, that makes sense. But then let's say China doesn't, and we have a concern about China seeking to be a global dominant empire, and if we can't enforce them to, because what enforcement mechanisms are we going to use that don't create war? Then does that just basically, and that increased GDP ends up being that they have relative to everyone else equals increased globalization and military powers? Are we just ceding the control of the world to China? Like, that's a very real set of theory of trade-off considerations. So your assessment of climate change can't be separate from your assessment of geopolitics and underlying economics. And so we don't assess the problems in a deep enough, interconnected enough way to come up with good solutions. And we don't have enough shared sense making that enough of the world wants to do the same things, right? So we can say,
what do you mean by sense making? What's that mean?
What is actually real? Is climate change at all, right? So if you talk to some environmentalists, like very good ones, like Lovelock, it's not only real, but it's already too late. There's nothing we can do about it, and the Earth will become uninhabitable. Other people say it's a very serious thing. It's on its way to that, but we still have time. There are other people that think that it's a real thing, but it's not that serious. The Earth changes, will migrate. And there are other people that think it's an utter hoax, right? Sense making. Have we been able to make sense of the world that we live in well enough to inform what we think are right choices? So when we think about democracy or republic, what we're talking about is a collective choice-making system. How do we not just make choice, me as an individual in my family or an individual economic actor choosing to buy or sell something, but we're going to share roads, we're going to share defense, we're going to decide that it does make sense to start that war or not. So in autocracy, we just basically, the power is ceded to whoever it is that's going to make that choice. But in a participatory governance, we're supposed to participate to do collective choice making. The basis of choice making, collective choice making, is collective sense making about what we think is actually happening, and sense making about what we think the effect of a particular injunction might be, and meaning making. What do we think is important that we're in service to? And communication, our ability to converse effectively enough with each other that we can get on the same page about this so that we can do collective choice making. So choice making has as its antecedents sense making, as its prerequisite sense making, meaning making, and communication.
And just to jump into sense making, you're reminding me of thinking of an ecology, right? And there's usually a keystone species of that you could kind of like point at and be like, for example, in Colombia, the jaguar. The jaguar's health is great. The Amazon's good. If it's not, Amazon's bad, right? It's a very simple way. So if we think of sense making as a term you mentioned earlier, which is beautiful, in information ecology, right? You take this information ecology and make sense of it. How is there something as simple as a keystone species where you could just be like, yeah, we're the health of our sense making right now it's fundamentally on the decline. It's not healthy. Is there something that we can point at that, or many things that we can point at where we're like, guys, our sense making ability is often, and in this model you described, it's almost like reminds me of the story of the princess and the pea, right? She's sleeping on a pea. She's so sensitive that if a pea is under her bed, it affects her, right? And so there's this almost a butterfly effect, a better approach of if this is off, right? How can we show people that this is off or that it's not? I think that should be a helpful place for us to start.
So I appreciate that as I'm sharing things, individual things I'm saying are sparking interest, and you're wanting to go down those avenues. What I also noticed is that about 6 strands open, which would actually be necessary to close to do a good job of this. And I apologize that part of looking at things in a more interconnected way means the chunk size is a little larger. And that's an important thing for people to understand, is that you can't fit a good assessment of anything into a tweet or into a short news bite. So an attention span...
Forgive me, I'm a millennial.
When attention spans go down, you become a worse sense maker for sure, because you have to compress the complexity of reality into something that will fit into the tiny attention. And so actually expanding attention to be able to hold multiple views, multiple epistemologies, all of the relevant things, so that you can then come up with a solution that's actually adequate is requisite. So I have heard is there a butterfly effect to affect sense making? Let me try to close a couple loops that maybe will bring it together. So we want to improve human coordination. We want to improve our sense making, where we all are better at having the capability of doing assessment of what is actually true, base reality. And you can see in the US right now, hydroxychloroquine is a wonder drug. It's an utter farce that actually kills more people if they use it. Masks really help. Masks make it worse. Systemic racism is this most critical issue in the nation. Systemic racism isn't even a thing in police violence, when statistically corrected, is worse for white people. On and on, right? China is trying to become a globally dominant empire. It's very close, or they're not. Like there's maximally polarized views around just base reality, because these aren't values. These are is something true, right? So clearly we are not doing a good job at collective sense making. So when we say we want to get collective coordination, we want to get our ability for everyone to actually know what is true empirically well, for us to be able to identify what values we're trying to serve and be able to hear the values someone else is trying to serve and say, are there better strategies that can serve these simultaneously? Maybe I care about the environment here. Maybe you care about your kids being able to get good jobs. And there's a particular proposition that's crafted in a way where if it goes through, your kids get good jobs and the environment's fucked, and vice versa. So I have to pretend like I don't care about kids getting good jobs. You have to pretend like you don't care about the environment, because the proposition is based on that theory of trade-offs. And I've now collapsed my values into a strategy to achieve them. But if I said, wait, I care about this, you care about that, is there a better proposition we can come up with for what could achieve both of them? So we separate the value from the strategy to achieve it. You can see that it almost seems mind-bogglingly ridiculous that we have a democracy where you vote on a proposition where you weren't involved in crafting what is a good proposition. So some special interest group that has a very narrow interest puts forward a proposition and markets it to a group of people where it's directly beneficial to them. And this is why almost every proposition gets about half the vote yes and half the vote no, which also means that it inherently polarizes the population, which is why democracies die younger. One of the main reasons is it's actually very hard to get lots of people to coordinate. It's very easy to have one person rule or a small number of people rule. And if you're creating a voting system where the people aren't doing good proposition creation first, it is necessarily polarizing, because the thing that you're voting for seems like it's actively trying to harm what is meaningful and sacred to me, and vice versa. So since the beginning of the thing we call civilization, very few total people have lived in democracies or republics. Almost everybody has lived in feudalism or autocracy of some kind. Democracies have emerged just a few times in rare little pockets. And when they've emerged, they have emerged following periods of cultural enlightenments. This is a really key insight. The cultural enlightenment, because this can come to your butterfly effect. Yeah. The cultural enlightenment, so the Athenian democracy, with all of its flaws, still a movement in the direction of more participatory governance, emerged out of a kind of Greek Enlightenment that valued everyone's ability to do better sense making. So let's really value education and the development of the individual. So everyone should learn history and formal logic and grammar and rhetoric and etc. So they can all actually make sense of base reality on their own and make good choices. And then they all also need the Socratic method, which means that they can argue any point. They can take other people's perspective well. And you can see how profoundly broken down that capacity and that value and orientation currently is. If you have a bunch of people that can make sense of reality directly on their own, not listen to what some authority said and decide which of the authorities they listen to, but direct empirical capacity, and then they can take each other's perspective, those people can have a conversation that will end up resulting in some ability for effective compromise and movement forward. But if the capacity for sense-making conversation breaks down, then the basis that gave rise to the democracy or republic being able to emerge breaks down. And so we can see that in the US came out of the European Enlightenment, where there was this kind of Renaissance idea of you don't just have to be a specialist at one thing, you can have a deep background in lots of things. Science, we can actually empirically all get a good base understanding of reality, and the Hegelian dialectic will always seek for any thesis an antithesis and then a higher order synthesis. Can we take multiple perspectives and try to find higher order reconciliation? That the underlying public education and fourth estate or news that are required for people to all be developed in their capacity to make sense of the world and participate in governance and to know what's going on have went through enough institutional decay that nobody really has a sense of what's going on, or to the degree they do, they are outraged and certain about things that half the population thinks that they're desperately wrong about, right? That they're outraged and certain about. So we can look at this as the collapse of the American empire, because you don't have the ability for a real republic, because you don't have participatory governments, because the prerequisites aren't there. Mm-hmm. We can also look at it in a bigger way, which is we can, and this will then wrap up, we can look at the breakdown of the first ever globalized world order that has been since World War II. Because of course empires got larger as time went on, and there was a game theoretic competition for more size. British Empire was not quite a world ruling empire, but after World War II, it was the first time that we could never have a war again between the major empires. We always had war between major empires, but they never had a nuke. They never had utterly catastrophic tech that made a war that no one could win. And so after World War II, we had to do something unprecedented and say, how do we never have a war between the major parties again? And so we said, well, we have to be so economically interdependent that it's never advantageous to bomb each other, because it is better to coordinate with each other. And so let's do globalization and have supply chains that interconnect us in such a way that we don't survive without import and export. Well, in a way that made sense, right? And we had proxy wars, but we didn't have major wars from then till now. But it also created one global civilization, really, because none of the nations really can operate on their own. A global civilization mediated by globalism that is profoundly fragile, where breakdown, a virus in one part of the world can become a virus in the entire world, can start breaking down supply chains, breaking down social fabric within countries, between countries. And so COVID was just a big enough thing to show the systemic fragility and the systemic fragility that's been cascading is really like the second and third order effects are really just starting to show up and will continue for some time. And obviously, when we look at the social tension that arose with George Floyd, it was a long-term issue. But after a tremendous amount of unemployment, of course, there's going to be more likelihood for violence in the street. Because when people's fundamental needs aren't met, you always get more willingness for violence. And so even that was one of the secondary effects of COVID-type effects. So what we're experiencing right now also is that the globalized world order, the kind of Bretton Woods agreements put in place are breaking down or almost totally broken down. The US has pulled out of NATO, out of WHO, decreased to the UN, and the major empires, the biggest countries in the world are doing cyber attacks on each other and espionage, and they know it. So it's not following peacetime agreements. It's basically unconventional war rather than conventional kinetic war, but it can
All right, hang tight, everyone.
switch into
We're going to
conventional
be
kinetic
getting
war. So we have a breakdown of the global order, and we have a
both
breakdown of
speakers
the
here,
country that
Daniel and
was leading the global order kind of
excuse me,
simultaneously. And then we have a very big question of, so what happens next?
Wade Davis
Do we have
together,
increasing chaos and like
facilitated by
population reduction, catastrophic risk writ large? Do we
Satya.
have China
So
moving
thanks for
to
hanging in here. We
actually
got some more great stuff
increasing
coming.
their
Please hang
coherent
in.
capacity to build trains all around the world and ports and whatever, and they run the world? And what does that look like? Or at the end of where the US has decayed to, can we reboot something like a meaningful participatory governance? If you were to want to reboot it, you have to drive a cultural enlightenment that is the prerequisite. So that this is the butterfly, is the high value on everyone's capacity to do much better sense making and much higher quality conversation so they can participate.
I think this is the exact conversation I want you and Wade to kind of discuss and digest, and that was beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, how are you feeling? Do you want to take a breath? How about we all take a breath and then we'll come back with Wade?
Sure.
Okay, great. I think it's almost like you've opened the connection of where both of you really fit in together. And I think now the audience gets both of you really well, where you're coming from. And I'm excited. Really fit in together. And I think now the audience gets both of you really well, where you're coming from. And I'm excited. Really fit in together. And I think now the audience gets both of you really well, where you're coming from. And I'm excited.
Hey everyone, keep hanging out for a sec. We're trying this new thing where we beam a Zoom call onto the inside of the PlayAlchemist Pyramid here. We'll get it straightened out in just a moment.
Really fit in together. And I think now the audience gets both of you really well, where you're coming from, and I'm excited. Really fit in together. And I think now the audience gets both of you really well, where you're coming from, and I'm excited. Really fit in together. And I think now the audience gets both of you really well, where you're coming from, and I'm excited to bring us all together and see what emerges. All of us. Thank you too for being here. This feels like such a poignant conversation this time. And what I find interesting about the two of you is that you guys are pointing at, I think, something very similar. And you're stumbling on it in two different ways. You're coming at it from two different angles. Wade, cultural anthropologist, storyteller. And you wrote this article you've shared with me, and feel free to expand on. You just feel like something had to be said.
Yeah, I mean, I just was going to say that, you introduced me to Daniel when we first connected, and I just loved listening to him. And when I was just listening to your conversation, it struck me that just how important it is to know history. I was just reading earlier today one of the classic books about Vietnam by Stanley Karnoff, and you just see how those men, Robert McNamara and Dean Rusk and Johnson and all their kind of various advisors, the scores of them, were just stumbling around in that void, doing what they tried to do, and it's almost agonizing to be reading the contemporary accounts of their decision making in 1963 to 4 to 5, knowing what was going to be the result. And the kind of analysis that Daniel just did, taking us through the patterns of history. He quoted Churchill, and another one of, I think, Churchill's saying, I think it was Churchill who said that, if you don't study history, you'll never, you're condemned to repeat the same mistakes over and over and over again. And in my little analysis of the COVID thing, what made it, I suppose, unique, and certainly what caused it to hit a nerve, is just the point of view, the kind of the anthropological lens that I was thinking of this less as a story of medicine than of culture. But Daniel takes us to a whole nother level of depth, right? And it raises the issue of how astonishing the important knowledge of history is for anyone who has the audacity to think that they can lead us or lead anyone, right? And when it's not trivial, that George Patton knew classical warfare of the Greeks in the the Mediterranean zone. It's not an accident that Churchill won the Nobel Prize for Literature and wrote more books than most contemporary politicians have read. And when you think of the most horrifying aspect of many horrifying aspects of the current administration in Washington, the word ignorant is really means without knowledge, lack of gnosis, right? And when you have a president who literally doesn't know when World War II began, who doesn't know the most fundamental aspects of history, who has never read anything, who famously doesn't read. And then when you contrast that to what we just heard from Daniel, unraveling the threads of history, the mystic connections of history that have brought us to where we are. My overwhelming impression listening to him is just how important, how vital a knowledge of history is in the moment, and certainly for those who have the gumption and the audacity to believe that they have the right to lead the rest of us.
And interesting as you're saying that, I was thinking about what you were speaking of is this Asian century, will it be Chinese led? And Xi Jinping is a very serious scholar of history, political theory, philosophy, military history. My understanding is actually a very serious translator and scholar of all of the kind of classic Chinese works. And that when he came to power, the people who were in high positions of the CCP all had to have a pretty high degree of background and training in the 36 stratagems and the art of war and the warring states region. And you can imagine if the US Senate and Congress all had to have the whole kind of history of Western philosophy and the canon and the Napoleonic Wars and Alexander the Great and et cetera, it'd be a different story, and kind of the founding fathers did, right? And this is one of the institutional things, is that when you're trying to emerge, you have to work really hard, but there's a way of kind of getting fat when you are the dominant empire and you've forgotten the problems, and the very hard work of staying actively educated and engaged doesn't seem immediately eminently necessary, and that's one of the things that leads to the decay.
I think that's so true. I mean, the famous quip by Kennedy when he welcomed all the Nobel laureates to the White House, and he said there wasn't as much intellectual firepower in that room since the last time Thomas Jefferson dined alone. And I think that's so true. I mean, there's an understandable but a kind of a disturbing American almost embrace of ignorance. There's a if you know too much, you're sort of you're not really a man or something. Certainly we're until 9/11, the vast majority of congressmen didn't even own passports. And one of the things that I've noticed, I used to lecture on private jet trips for the National Geographic that would go around the world. And they were very, very expensive trips for people. And generally the individuals who came along were really wonderful people, very, very affluent by definition. And they had all had incredibly successful careers, but their careers had focused on making the most hospital beds or something, or running this corporation and being a real expert on packaged meats or something like that. But outside of that expertise, outside of golf, football, and sports, there just wasn't as if a general education was deemed to be that essential to corporate affairs. I mean, I used to go through this with my own father-in-law, who was very well read compared to normal politicians, but he was a most beloved man, the most wonderful man, the greatest, the embodiment of everything that a great American is, in my opinion. But he was Senate Foreign Relations Committee chairman, almost president. He was offered the vice presidency by Richard Nixon, and he turned it down. He supported Rockefeller. When he came to visit us at our fish camp in northern British Columbia, guidebook in hand, he came over to me and said, "Wade, did you know Canada was the second biggest country on earth?" And then he was very desperate to have a newspaper, and the nearest newspaper we could get for him was a 4-day-old copy of the Toronto Globe and Mail, which a Bush pilot brought in. And Granddaddy's sitting there by the fire, very, very content with the newspaper at last. But then he quizzically looks at me, pulls down the newspaper and looks up from his bifocals and said, "Wade, why is there so much news on Canada in this newspaper?" And those are kind of not gentle cliches. And obviously Granddaddy at that point was past his prime. So I'm not being in any way, but there is this this sense that to know too much is to be almost suspect in the United States. And I don't think that was certainly true in the Kennedy era. Maybe they thought they knew too much in the case of someone like McNamara, but certainly, knowledge of the world has never been a credential for political office in the United States.
I'll share a couple thoughts on partly how I think we got here, and it's by no means a comprehensive addressing, because I think there's actually quite a few threads that are involved. What makes someone particularly good in the market and what makes them comprehensively educated about history don't necessarily overlap all that well. And doing very well in the market means that you can influence DC to have people do your bidding, and the people who are susceptible to do that will do better and whatever. So there's a whole bunch of other reasons, but a couple reasons that maybe are slightly less often thought about and valuable. One is, I think the focus in the types of knowledge that mattered coming out of World War II made a very drastic shift to STEM focus because of the critical role that technology played in the war. And we can see that it was like we built the entire Manhattan Project around Oppenheimer and like a few people who had really asymmetric technological and physical insights, and Bletchley Park around, and a couple major things around Turing and von Neumann that pretty much determined the war, right? Like the bomb and the computer. And so, and then
synthetic rubber.
Yeah.
Synthetic rubber was the third example.
And Sputnik getting there first, I think there was this very real sense of, and one way to look at World War II was the competition between the US and the Russians for the German scientists. And not just, so Operation Paperclip here and the Russian version of it, there's this famous joke that who would win the Cold War between the USSR and USA was who got the better Nazi scientists. But like it played a significant role. But I think there became a very heavy focus in let's focus on STEM. But George Washington said it should be the primary aim of this government to train every single citizen in the science of government. And the science of government meant history, politics, game theory, courtier dynamics, etc. Because if they didn't understand it, those who did would run everything, and it would become a kleptocracy and then an oligarchy or some weird thing, not a democracy. So I think the civics training became very de-emphasized. That's one part. The other part I think is very important is, and this is, so I'm going to say something that I think is more sympathetic with the anti-intellectual movement, is I think the anti-intellectual movement was a game theoretic counter strategy to intellectualism used as a political weapon. And things can be true that are not representative of the whole truth, right? Like one of the things I see all the time is people say, well, obviously herbs and supplements and peptides don't really work that well because there aren't that many phase 3 clinical trials showing that they work, and there are for pharma meds. Well, there's no fucking money because there's no patentability on any of those things. Of course, they'll never get phase 3 trials. And the phase 3 trials that showed that Premarin worked or Vioxx worked didn't mean that they didn't kill massive numbers of people, because what's included in the scope of the safety analysis. And so it's true, those phase 3 clinical trials are true. And if you are literate, you understand that they're true, but they're not representative, right? Because if here's the whole space of possible health interventions, the ones that are profitable will get the most research, and they represent this space. So then the preponderance of data is an uneven distribution, right? So similarly, I can put an IPCC together and say all of the stuff on climate change, but it doesn't, DC's still running the benign China hypothesis and not looking at that particular issue seriously. Bannon was actually a big part of, and Trump delivering the US from the benign China hypothesis. So there was a way that I see that throughout history, whenever something becomes a source of legitimate authority, whether it's the church or academia, then there's so much power in being the one who says what is true, that then anyone who's very good at the game of power has a maximum incentive to try to capture and influence that legitimate authority. So the legitimate authority starts getting influenced by who's funding it and how the prestige networks work and those types of things. So then legitimate authority in the US started to have a particular set of political biases that a lot of people in the US didn't feel represented their interests well. And so, but they couldn't argue against the IPCC thing well, but they could feel like it was not aligned with their interests. So anti-intellectualism, since they couldn't compete at it, was actually their counterweapon. I just won't engage with the weapons that you're using that feel like they're against me. And so one of the ways I think to actually have sense making really be able to be pervasive is that it is not weaponized for partial political or economic agendas, that it is authentically seeking to understand the entire space and be in the benefit of everyone, as opposed to that as a virtue signal. Otherwise, I think the anti-intellectualism becomes a natural counterweapon.
Let me ask you about China, because one of the things that was interesting in the criticism of my article, I was a number of people, Jeffrey Sachs for one, a friend of mine who founded Code Pink, quite liberal individual, were very critical of my last paragraph when I essentially said we'll miss the American era if China is in control. And I cited in that the treatment of the Uyghurs, the social contracts, the social capital thing, and just the treatment of democracy, et cetera. And there's a sort of thing on the left that we're now bashing China. And is that the left being reflexively counter to whatever Trump is doing because Trump's bashing China, therefore we shouldn't bash China? And then you parse it down and you see that Jeffrey Sachs is up to his eyeballs in contracts with the Chinese government. And I know that in my travels around the world, I've seen the footprint of China virtually everywhere. I mean, just if you can build your way to dominance, that's what they're doing. I mean, the police station in Rarotonga, the opera house in Dakar, an interchange in Togo, in Lomé, the capital of Togo. I mean, obviously the Belt Initiative, but also great roads across the Amazon, and I've also, of course, seen firsthand what has happened to Tibet. And there seems to be this thing, as long as China does development work, it's, build stuff, that somehow it's okay, and that they're not, and that gets back into this whole thing where genocide is universally condemned, but ethnocide, the destruction of people's life, is not only not condemned, it's considered proper development policy in many quarters. So what is your sense of China and the next century?
Yeah, it's such a critical question. I don't claim to know what's in Xi Jinping's mind or what the internal plans and sense making of the CCP are. And nor do I represent that whatever those are represents the actual will of all the Chinese people outside of Beijing, which it obviously doesn't.
Let me just sort of interrupt, Daniel, but you're so right in that. I mean, there is a terrible tendency in the West to see China as this monolith, when in fact, of course, it's remarkably diverse, ethnically, vast country, vast numbers of people, vast orientations, and so on. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm not going to say that there aren't some people who have a xenophobic, racist relationship just because it seems big and scary and they don't like the big scary things, so they make it the Chinese monolith. Of course, there is some reactive, non-thinking part of that. I wouldn't say that that is much dumber than the benign China hypothesis was. I would say those are kind of equally not clear assessments. I think The 100-Year Marathon is a particularly interesting book around China's long-term plan starting in, give or take, 1949, and that is kind of tracking quite well. I think we've had a period where nobody remembers in their own lived experience very serious war in the developed world. And so they don't really have any embodied sense that that's even a thing. So their actual sense of history is quite bad, right? Like their embodied sense is quite bad. And so they don't recognize that like slavery and genocide and initiating war and empire has been kind of the story for the whole history of civilization. Everybody, like, it's not just been European white slavery. It was the Ottomans and Turks enslaving Europeans. It was people in Asia in slavery, inter-Asian slavery. It was, Comanche violence with other First Tribes people. Like, largely humans have just been kind of violent fucks for a long time, often. And that's an important part of the story. So when we say the US was built on genocide and slavery, and how can it have any kind of moral value, that's a very real story. And like, what do we do for reparations on genocide and slavery? And the whole world was in a context of slavery and genocide. Arguably, you could say British colonialism was less violent than Dutch or Spanish or some of the other colonialisms. You go to the Congo and whatever in some ways. So this is why the historical context is important. And so then I'm going to think of China in light of that. If I put myself in my imagining of Xi's position, I'm actually quite empathetic to everything he's doing. And in some ways, I can say it's the smartest thing anyone in the world is doing, because there are some critical problems that it appears he's paying attention to that no one else is even paying earnest attention to. So I'm very empathetic to the solutions he has. That doesn't mean I like the solutions or want them to happen. So just to kind of briefly frame that, rule of law requires a monopoly of violence. If you don't have a monopoly of violence, how do you enforce rule of law? If we say you can't cut down the parks, but the dudes who are cutting down the trees have bigger guns than the police do, then you can cut down the parks, right? Well, how do you have monopoly of violence when individuals or small groups can make catastrophic weapons that can destroy whole cities and whatever? Because exponential tech makes that possible, where I can get access to CRISPR gene drives and people in their basement can make bioweapons, or drones with thermite bombs that are like easy to make, that can take out massive aspects of infrastructure. This problem of, I can do way more damage with an AR-15 than a knife, but I can do way more damage with a CRISPR gene drive than an AR-15. And it was very hard to make nukes. I needed nation state capacity to make nukes, but I don't need nation state capacity to make drone weapons. And so we have an emerging world where decentralized, or cyber weapons that can take out infrastructure. We have a place where decentralized exponential tech makes the world frail in a way that there's no precedent in all of history for. This is why we need history, and we also need imagination, right? And forecasting. And so what do we do about that? What do we do when people can, in their basement, not just be going crazy and getting an AR-15 with a lot of clips, but they can be building CRISPR weapons? China's answer is there is no answer other than ubiquitous surveillance. You need a ubiquitous surveillance to be able to suppress a harm that is that great, and the harm of the suppression is less bad than the harm of doing that thing. And that's actually kind of understandable, right? And they're also not in the position of seeing that the US as having been as like innocent and rosy as a lot of people in the US do, because from the outside, the predatory debt lending they've been doing all over the world for the last 20 years, we were doing for a lot longer than that. They just kind of took the World Bank model, copied it, and made it better. The wars that we waged, whatever. So I'm very empathetic to why China is doing what it's doing. And I'm actually very impressed with its ability to build high-speed trains all around the world when we can't fix roads, right? Autocracy with no term limit, so you can do 100-year planning with no internal coordination costs, is an amazing system to build shit. That said, I think if anyone who's concerned about racism in the US doesn't look at the Chinese treatment of the Uyghur and take very seriously what is its actual view towards racial justice, like demonstrably. And if the way we're dealing with it in the US is leading to increasing division of the US, which leads to the rapidity of its breakdown, which is ceding the 21st century to Chinese AI technologically empowered autocracy with that value system, are we just being short-sighted as fuck about actual racism over the next century or any other issue like that? I think Xi also has paid attention into civilizational collapse better because he also has a longer history, right? China has a much longer history. And so he knows that civilizational collapse happens because you get overthrown externally, you have internal descent, or you run out of resources. So he's worked to have a 100-year resource acquisition plan, which Belt and Road and String of Pearls and whatever are part of. The Sesame credit system and the IoT surveillance system ensures that internal descent can't happen. And an adequate military ensures that nobody can overthrow them without catastrophic risk to themselves. But any people should think about, how do I prevent our own people from going through civilizational collapse? So like, I'm simultaneously very empathetic with and want answers really better than those answers.
Well, and there's another thing that I think that people in the West fail to understand is just the reflex for order that goes back to the whole Confucian ideology, and you realize what China has actually endured over the last 150 years, not just the humiliation leading to the Boxer Rebellion, but the Great Leap Forward, which led to 48 million people dying of starvation, the chaos of the Cultural Revolution, 35 million people dying in the Civil War and World War II. I mean, it's no wonder that the Chinese citizenry is perfectly happy with the stability that the social credit system is invoking. I mean, the polls say that Chinese people like it because they just want order, predictability.
I wouldn't say I could trust those polls because of the credit system. There's a self-reinforcing dynamic.
Right, of course.
My sense is, from what I have heard of people who have lived and spent a lot of time throughout various regions of China, is that the further you get in actual miles outside of Beijing, the less kind of CCP standard narrative that people hold. And it's large enough that, as powerful as the CCP is, it still can't unify 1 point whatever it is, 5-8 billion people. We think the number is probably a lot higher than the reported number, all that well. Like, that's a hard thing to do. And this actually, one of my concerns is, I think the benign China hypothesis of like, no, China's just trying to grow its people, they're not trying to become a world empire, don't worry about it, is completely dreadful. But also, Chinese are the great bad guys is the only thing that could unify all of China against the West, right? Because the people who are there like Louis Vuitton, and they like Silicon Valley, and they like Hollywood, but they won't if the message they keep hearing is that Americans don't like the Chinese.
No, I think
I really want to separate the view of the Chinese from a particular regime.
Well, and there's a whole issue of face and push comes to shove, the motherland is the motherland, and no, that's fascinating. You should write a book about this. I think
we've got 23 books, which is impressive, and I have none. So my best chance of any of this being in a book is you and I having conversations.
Well, listen, this has been really wonderful. Both of you guys, I've got to pull off actually for some family stuff on Labor Day weekend, but
Absolutely.
I've really, Satya and Daniel, I really want to keep in touch with you, man. I've really enjoyed both this dialogue and our previous one on the phone. So it's an honor to be with you, man.
Thank you so much, Wade. Thank you for your time. Thank you for
everybody.
Just, honoring us with your presence and attention, and thank you for your work.
Great. Thanks, Satya.
Genuinely appreciate it.
Okay, Daniel.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Great.
And who put this on? Appreciate it.
I'm going to turn my video on, and can we turn my video on? I would love to thank everyone. Great. Wow. Daniel, Wade, thank you so much. We here at PlayAlchemist really believe that was your viewpoints, your messages, the work that you guys have been spending your lifetimes really being together is just so important to give voice to in this moment. So thank you for giving voice to it. Thank you for doing it. Thank you for being it. Thank you for coming together here in this multiverse of a virtual pyramid of Burning Man. I want to take a moment and thank the entire team that brought this together. I want to thank the builders, the build crew. As you can imagine, the crew that built this pyramid was a little different than the one that built last year's pyramid. I just completely amazed with what they were able to create. If you're in the pyramid and you give us some emoji love, that'd be amazing. I want to thank the co-founders of this camp.
All right, everyone. Thank you very much. Thank you from AltSpace VR. Thank you from this particular
Eugene,
burner
Brian,
who's speaking to you right now.
Katie,
thank
Keegan,
you from PlayAlchemist.
Genevieve, Drew, Yunji.
Thanks for being here. Thanks
This has
for
been a
being
week
part
of getting to know
what
you
we've been putting
guys, to really kind of be in the trenches with y'all.
So we're gonna have this one again.
You reminded me of what Burning Man's all about.
There's still plenty
People
more.
coming
There's
together,
still plenty more to explore.
putting aside their differences. and
I
creating
don't
something
think
beautiful.
that's one of the good things about this.
Thank you all for that.
This Sunday is that
Thank you all in
we
the
don't have
audience.
to spend all our time tearing down camp.
Give us your time and attention.
So it's my hope that there's going
Please
to
look out
be
for an incredible.
some Burning Man for you to taste tomorrow, and the next
I don't know
day.
what to call it.
and the
Maybe
next
like a
day,
mini doc of
until
this
we're
whole
able to come
experience.
back together in the dust. Thanks everyone for being here. This is Druffin.
It's been amazing. I was extremely skeptical
Man, I love
coming
that.
into this burn, and
Oh, thanks everyone. Make some friends.
This was one of my most
I
profound
think
burns
that I'm
ever,
still
and it was
stuck.
because
I
of all
can't
of you that
mute
showed up.
everyone here.
So thank you all.
But it's been really tremendous, as Satya said. Thanks everyone for being here.